A single empire in Europe would take over a quarter of the planet's land and population. The foundations began on the lands of England, with a powerful British monarchy igniting an extraordinary story of exploration and world domination. The British Empire saw the greatest stories of human achievement and triumph, but also saw the worst sides of humanity. After the discovery of America around 500 years ago, they ventured out into the oceans. The British would encounter unknown civilizations, creating historic partnerships and rivalries. Within 4 centuries, the empire would be worth over $600 billion. But how did an empire that owned parts of the Americas, Asia, Africa, and even Australia eventually come to an end? We must start from the beginning. Long before the knowledge of far-flung places, a man by the name of King Alfred the Great had to defend his small Anglo-Saxon kingdom from the invading Danish Vikings. In 878 AD, the Vikings under Guthrum launched a massive invasion, and Alfred was forced to retreat to the marshlands of Somerset, where he sought refuge on the Isle of Athelney. Alfred used this time to regroup and gather loyal followers. He formed a strong army, and in a decisive battle at Edington, he defeated the Viking leader Guthrum. The victory forced Guthrum to sign the Treaty of Wedmore, which established the Dane Law, a region of England where Viking rule was officially recognized, but also secured peace between the Vikings and the Anglo-Saxons. He then began the process of unifying all of the Anglo-Saxon kingdom, which his grandson Athelstan would finish. In 924, when Athelstan ascended to the throne of Wessex, his rule faced opposition and challenges from rival claimants, particularly from the Viking-controlled areas of Northumbria and Mercia. Despite these obstacles, Athelstan proved to be a capable and determined leader. In 927 AD, Athelstan managed to conquer Northumbria and effectively unite England under his rule, which led Athelstan to be the first king of England. 200 years later, that battleground would be set when English King Henry II wanted to expand his kingdom to Ireland. In the spring of 1171, King Henry II, accompanied by a retinue of knights and soldiers, sailed from England to Waterford, Ireland. Upon his arrival, he quickly set about asserting his authority, demanding the submission of various Irish kings and chieftains to his rule. Henry was determined to establish English control over Ireland, and firmly believed that the Irish kings should acknowledge his sovereignty. As news of King Henry's arrival spread across the island, reactions among the Irish leaders were mixed. However, when various Irish bishops and clergymen met at the Synod of Cashel in 1171, these religious leaders recognized Henry II as the sovereign ruler of Ireland, acknowledging his authority to rule the island, making Ireland the first colony of England, long before anyone knew they would be a global empire. Another 100 years later, in 1277, King Edward I of England wanted to bring Wales under his control and incorporate it into his kingdom. His desire to conquer Wales was driven by strategic, political, and territorial motivations. The journey towards the conquest of Wales began with the First Welsh War in 1277. Edward I launched a determined invasion into Gwynedd, the heartland of Welsh resistance in North Wales. His forces clashed with the Welsh defenders. Though fierce and relentless, the Welsh were eventually defeated, and their ruler, Prince Llewellyn, was compelled to submit to Edward's authority. Having established his dominance in Gwynedd, Edward I set out to solidify his control over Wales. He understood that military might alone not be enough to subdue the Welsh spirit of resistance, so he devised a multi-pronged strategy. One of the critical components of his plan was to construct a network of imposing fortresses across Wales to maintain English dominance and keep the Welsh in check. Despite the initial show of force, Welsh resistance persisted, and in 1282, a second conflict erupted known as the Second Welsh War. The war was fierce and hard-fought, but fate was not on the side of the Welsh. With the Welsh resistance largely quelled, Edward I swiftly solidified his conquest, making Wales part of the English kingdom. England's war struggles aren't done yet. From 1337 to 1453, the 100-Year War began with England and France. The everlasting conflict weakened both empires and kept England tied to their tiny island. Right after the 100 Years' War, England was amid another war. This time, it was between the House of Lancaster and the House of York in the infamous War of the Roses from 1455 to 1487. The Lancastrians won, and King Henry VI was declared king. The rest of the world was starting to open up. Christopher Columbus sailed the ocean blue in 1492 and landed in the Bahamas. After his initial landing, Columbus explored several other islands in the Caribbean, including Cuba and Hispaniola, now shared between the Dominican Republic and Haiti. He also explored the coasts of present-day Central and South America, including Venezuela and Panama. This discovery of a massive landmass led the British government to desire land on this new continent. When Italian Giovanni Caboto sought support from King Henry VII to explore this new continent and find a direct route to Asia, King Henry was intrigued and granted Caboto a patent, which authorized him to explore and claim any lands he might discover for the English crown. Giovanni changed his name to John Cabot, and he was ready to go. In May 1497, Cabot set sail from Bristol, England, in hopes to find a passageway to Asia. He led a crew of about 18 men aboard a small ship called the Matthew. Their journey across the Atlantic was challenging, as they faced treacherous weather conditions and unknown dangers. After several weeks at sea, on June 24, 1497, Cabot and his crew finally spotted land. They had arrived somewhere along the eastern coast of North America, in an area later named Newfoundland, as it was newfound land. Cabot and his crew were greeted by an unfamiliar landscape and encountered indigenous peoples, likely the Beothuk or Mi'kmaq, who had lived in the region for thousands of years. Cabot claimed the land for England, planting the English flag on the shore and taking possession of the newly discovered territory. The exact duration of Cabot's stay in the New World is uncertain, but it is believed that he explored the coastline briefly before returning to England, arriving back in Bristol in August 1497, where he was celebrated as a hero for his achievements. Cabot's discovery spread quickly throughout Europe, generating great excitement and interest. His successful voyage provided the English with hope of finding a western route to Asia and competing with other European powers in the lucrative trade markets of the East. Encouraged by his success, Cabot made a second voyage in 1498, possibly intending to explore further and solidify England's claim to the newfound lands. However, the details of this expedition are lost to history. Some reports suggest that the voyage was successful, while others claim it ended in disaster, with Cabot and his crew lost at sea. While back in England, King Henry VIII was married to his first wife, Catherine of Aragon. During their beginning years of marriage, everything was going fine. Like any king at the time, he was forced to be loyal to the Catholic Church and yearned for a strong and legitimate heir to secure his dynasty. However, Henry's heart grew heavy with a troubling dilemma as the years passed. His marriage to Catherine of Aragon had only yielded a single surviving child, Princess Mary. The king's desperate desire for a male heir began to consume him, and he became increasingly convinced that his marriage was invalid in the eyes of God. Turning to the Pope for a solution, Henry beseeched the Holy See to grant him an annulment of his marriage to Catherine. He argued that the marriage was unlawful, for Karen had previously been married to his older brother Arthur, who had passed away. According to the Old Testament, marrying one's brother's widow was strictly forbidden, and Henry believed this was why he lacked a male heir. However, fate had other plans. The Pope, influenced by Catherine's powerful nephew, Emperor Charles V of Spain, refused to grant the annulment. Frustration and desperation gripped the king's heart, and he made a momentous decision. In a bold and unprecedented move, Henry VIII decided to break away from the Roman Catholic Church and establish his own church within England. So, in 1534, the English Parliament passed the Act of Supremacy, formally severing England's ties to the papacy and officially creating the Church of England, with King Henry VIII to be its spiritual leader, and Anglicism was born. After King Henry divorced and beheaded his other wives, his daughter from Catherine, Mary I, became queen, and was nicknamed Bloody Mary through her killing spree to re-establish Catholicism. But her reign was short-lived, as her half-sister Elizabeth I would soon take over and redeclare England to be a Protestant state. Elizabeth passed the Act of Supremacy in 1559, which made Elizabeth supreme governor of the Church of England. She also passed the Act of Uniformity, establishing the Book of Common Prayer as the official liturgy. However, outside of England, the race for colonization has already begun. Under King Philip, the Spanish established colonies across the South American continent. The Spanish were expanding their wealth, from the former capital of the Aztec, Tenochtitlan, to Machu Picchu in Peru, and the Andes Mountains in Chile. Along the Brazilian coast, the Portuguese had several settlements, like São Vicente, Pernambuco, and Rio de Janeiro. The French established northern colonies in Quebec, and some small territories in Florida called Fort Caroline. The race for overseas land was on. So, Queen Elizabeth commissioned an army of seafarers to discover this planet. The group, colloquially known as the Sea Dogs, was given legal access to pillage and loot all Spanish ships they saw, with the hopes of creating British dominance on the global stage. One of her first appointees was John Hawkins, a pardoned killer who saved his life by joining the Royal Navy. In 1561, Hawkins made a voyage down to the Canary Islands, a Spanish island colony off the coast of Africa. Hawkins saw a process that would make him wealthy and hurt human beings. He learned about how to capture and sell people into slavery. With his new knowledge, in 1562, Hawkins set sail, traveling along the African coast to Sierra Leone, where he captured 300 Africans and trapped them in their ship. From there, he sailed to the Caribbean. He did not have permission from either Spain or Portugal to trade with their colonies, so he sold his enslaved people in Isabela, Puerto de Plata, and Monte Cristi, places where the local authorities did not enforce government trade embargoes. The enslaved people were traded for pearls, hides, and sugar. The trade was so prosperous that when he returned to England, he was knighted and to be called Sir. In October 1564, Hawkins went on another voyage back to Sierra Leone. He took over 400 enslaved people from Africa. Some he bought from the Portuguese, others he kidnapped directly by raiding the coast. He left Africa on January 29, 1565. On April 3, 1565, Hawkins arrived at Borborada in Venezuela. As trade was prohibited, he carried out a fake threat of force with the local governor's collusion. He then traveled to Rio de la Hacha, where he used power to ensure the deals he thought were fair. He sold 300 enslaved people. He was paid in gold, silver, and other precious items, and took further orders to trade enslaved people on a future voyage. His third slave voyage wasn't as easy as the first two. When he arrived on the African coast, he could not gather any enslaved people because of a Portuguese embargo. He attempted to capture and kidnap the inhabitants of a village near Cape Verde, but he was wounded and had to retreat. Hawkins recruited a local king in Sierra Leone to help him forcibly kidnap people, capturing over 500 people. On February 7, 1568, he set sail across the Atlantic Ocean to sell these people. He sold some of his captives in Margarita Province and others in Borborada. At Rio de la Hacha, the governor refused him permission to trade, so Hawkins and his assistant Francis Drake shot at his house, and they took over the town before selling the enslaved people. On his retreat, though, the voyage ran into the Spanish port of San Juan de Ulua because of a storm. The Spanish cannons roared to life in the middle of peace talks, sending cannonballs hurtling through the air towards the English ships. Though outnumbered, Hawkins' fleet maneuvered skillfully, evading the deadly projectiles and returning fire with cannons. The battle raged on, and the English sailors fought with fierce determination. However, amid the chaos, Hawkins and his men had a choice: retreat or spend the rest of their lives in a Spanish galley. 114 men became prisoners, while Hawkins and 15 others returned to England and made a handsome profit. Regardless of the morals, slavery was a lucrative business, and the English would do anything to protect it. That's when, in 1577, she sent Francis Drake to find a new trade passage to Asia. Unlike previous explorers, Drake knew of the existence of America and wanted to find a way around the massive landmass so they could reach the lands of Asia. Drake's first destination was around Cape Horn, the southern tip of South America. The fierce winds roared and the waves towered like mountains, testing the crew's resolve and camaraderie, but Drake's steady leadership and unwavering determination carried them through, and they emerged from the Strait of Magellan into the boundless Pacific Ocean. The world was their oyster as they sailed northward along the western coast of South America. The landscapes were a tapestry of untamed beauty, and the wildlife fascinated and intrigued them. As they journeyed onward, they reached a land of wonder, the present-day coast of California. Here, they made a landfall in a place of beauty and bounty, naming it Nova Albion in honor of England, their beloved homeland. Their voyage then stretched through the Pacific and took them to Indonesia, which was aptly called the Spice Islands at the time, a treasure trove of fragrant delights. Here, they traded with the welcoming locals, exchanging goods and stories from distant lands. The journey homeward was challenging. The vastness of the Indian Ocean and the unpredictable seas tested them, but Drake's ingenuity and determination guided them safely around the Cape of Good Hope, the southern tip of Africa. Finally, after nearly 3 years of adventure and discovery, the Golden Hind returned to England in September 1580 and was knighted as Sir Francis Drake. Looking upon this new world, the English realized that if they wanted to grow as an empire, they would need to establish a colony in the new world. In 1584, Queen Elizabeth I granted Sir Walter Raleigh a charter to explore and colonize the lands of the New World. Raleigh dispatched an expedition led by Sir Richard Grenville to Roanoke Island, off the coast of present-day North Carolina. The group consisted of about 100 men, including soldiers, scientists, and artisans. They arrived in 1585 and began building a fort and interacting with the local Native American tribes. The relationship between the English colonists and the Native Americans was initially positive, as they traded goods and exchanged knowledge. However, tensions rose over time, and the region's harsh conditions, including disease and food shortages, strained the colonists' morale. Amid the challenges, Sir Francis Drake, on his way back to England after another successful privateering expedition, offered to take the colonists back with him. Disheartened by the hardships, many of the settlers accepted the offer and returned to England in 1586, leaving the Roanoke colony to fail. Raleigh tried again a year later in 1587 with 118 settlers, but yet it was found abandoned just 3 years later. In 1588, Spanish King Philip II felt he had a moral duty to take over England in the name of Catholicism, so he sent the Spanish Armada, which wasn't just an ordinary naval force. It was arguably one of the scariest ones in history. The Armada consisted of around 130 ships. Among these ships were galleons, which were the principal warships of the Armada. Galleons were large, heavily armed vessels that were the backbone of the Spanish fleet during that period. Accompanying the fleet were more than 30,000 soldiers, sailors, and marines who were part of the expedition. The soldiers were seasoned veterans, while the sailors were experienced navigators and crew members, many of whom had participated in previous naval campaigns. The Spanish Armada was intended to be a formidable force capable of overpowering any opposition and making England a colony of the Spanish Empire. On the other side of the English Channel, Queen Elizabeth and her advisors were well aware of the impending threat. She called upon her naval commander, Sir Francis Drake, and her vice admiral, Charles Howard, to prepare the English fleet for the upcoming battle. Despite being outnumbered and having fewer and smaller ships, the English Navy had a significant advantage in maneuverability and firepower. In the late spring of 1588, the Spanish Armada sailed towards England, confident of its superiority. However, the English had a cunning plan. Using smaller, more agile ships, they sacked the Armada as it made its way along the coast of England. The English ships would attack from the rear, firing salvos at the larger, slower Spanish vessels, and then quickly retreat, making it difficult for the Armada to respond effectively. As the Spanish fleet approached the English Channel, the English sent 8 fire ships, vessels loaded with flammable materials and set ablaze, towards the Armada. The sight of the fiery infernos heading their way unnerved the Spanish sailors, who broke formation to avoid the risk of being consumed by the flames. This disruption further weakened the Spanish fleet and allowed the English to gain a tactical advantage. The decisive Battle of Gravelines came on July 29, 1588, off the coast of Gravelines, France. The English fleet engaged the Spanish Armada in a fierce and prolonged battle. The English employed innovative naval tactics, including shipboarding techniques involving grappling hooks and small arms fire to engage the enemy at close quarters. After a full day of intense fighting, the Spanish Armada, battered and disoriented, attempted to regroup. However, the English were relentless in their pursuit. With dwindling supplies and morale, the Armada began to retreat, trying to navigate back to Spain. The journey back to Spain was a harrowing one for the Spanish Armada. Harsh storms and strong currents took their toll on the already weakened fleet. By the time the remnants of the Armada reached Spain, it was but a shadow of its former self. While closer to home, England wanted to expand their power over Ireland. At the time, Ireland was divided into 2 main regions, the Pale and the Gaelic Irish regions. The Pale, which is located under the Greater Dublin region, was under English control and authority, while the Gaelic Irish regions were largely autonomous and operated under traditional Brian law. In the Gaelic Irish regions, the English sought to assert more control over the island and imposed policies that threatened the Irish way of life, leading to rising tensions and discontent among the Gaelic lords. Hugh O'Neill, the Earl of Tyrone, was in the middle of this brewing storm. He was a man of noble birth and strong convictions, torn between his loyalty to the English crown and his love for the land and its people. As the Earl of Tyrone, he held significant sway over the province of Ulster, located in the north of the country. He, though, was tired of all the power-hungry demands of the English Empire, and could not bear to see his beloved Ireland suffer under the yoke of foreign rule. It was time for a rebellion. Hugh O'Neill raised his banner, calling upon other Gaelic lords to join him in a resistance. Among those who rallied to his cause was Hugh O'Donnell, the Earl of Tyrconnell, a fierce and noble warrior in his own right. United in purpose, the 2 lords formed a formidable alliance, determined to face the storm that awaited them. The English crown responded swiftly, sending forth armies led by seasoned commanders like Sir Henry Bagenal. Battle after battle ensued, each skirmish leaving the countryside scarred with the remnants of the struggle. As the days turned into months and then into years, the rebellion earned the name of the 9 Years' War. The Irish people and the English suffered, for the conflict brought untold hardships to both sides. As the Irish were near defeat, in 1601, a glimmer of hope appeared on the horizon when a small Spanish expeditionary force arrived to aid the Irish rebels. It was a welcome respite, and the tide seemed to turn in their favor for a moment. But fate had other plans. The turning point came at the Battle of Kinsale, where the Irish and Spanish forces suffered a crushing defeat. The dream of independence disappeared, and the rebellion's fate hung in the balance. In 1603, the rebellion came to an end. The Irish forces, tired and depleted, surrendered to the English crown. The terms of the Treaty of Mellifont granted pardons to the rebels, allowing them to retain some of their lands and religious freedoms. However, the treaty also led for the language of Gaelic to be systematically destroyed. Catholicism was to be strongly discouraged, only Anglicanism. Ireland was to be transformed into England, to no longer be a Gaelic country, but one of the Anglo-Saxons. However, England didn't just want to be the master of its neighbors, it wanted control over the New World. So, in 1606, the Virginia Company of London was founded to find wealth and a passage to the Pacific. With the blessing of King James on December 20th, 1606, 104 settlers left the River Thames in London and, throughout the cold, blistery winter, went off to the New World. After a grueling winter on sea, on the fateful day of May 13th, 1607, the settlers arrived on a marshy peninsula in a town they've named Jamestown, after their king. Upon reaching the shores of the New World, the colonists marveled at the breathtaking beauty of the untamed land. The lush green forests, crystal clear waters, and abundant wildlife promised a paradise. But paradise quickly turned into a harsh reality. The unfamiliar environment presented numerous challenges. With its relentless heat and humidity, the Virginia climate proved unbearable for many. Disease spread among the settlers, taking its toll on their health and strength. Malaria and dysentery ran rampant, claiming many lives and making each day a struggle for survival. The colonists faced another formidable adversary: hunger. They had arrived when crops were not yet ready for harvest. With dwindling supplies and no fertile soil to plant, the settlers found themselves on the brink of starvation. Their situation was dire, but the settlers' spirits were not quickly broken. They toiled day and night, determined to find a way to survive and thrive in this new land. They explored the surroundings, hoping to find sustenance and establish relations with the native inhabitants, the Powhatan Confederacy. However, the initial interactions with the Powhatans were fraught with misunderstandings and mistrust. The settlers struggled to communicate and negotiate, leading to clashes and heightened tensions. The Powhatans, understandably cautious of these strangers, did not readily embrace the newcomers. Leadership within the colony also faced challenges. With shifting power dynamics and a lack of solid direction, the settlers grappled with maintaining unity and order. The departure of their bold leader, John Smith, further exacerbated the situation, leaving them adrift. In the harsh winter of 1609, known as the Starving Time, the colonists faced their darkest hour. Food supplies ran out, and desperation set in. They ate whatever they could find, even horses, pets, and leather, but it was never enough. The colony's population dwindled as hunger, disease, and conflicts with the Powhatans took their toll. Despite all odds, a glimmer of hope emerged. A young and innovative settler, John Rolfe, introduced tobacco cultivation to Jamestown. The crop thrived in the Virginia soil and climate, bringing financial prosperity to the struggling colony. Tobacco quickly became a valuable commodity, attracting more settlers and rejuvenating Jamestown's fortunes. With their determination renewed, the settlers worked tirelessly to build a better future. They established better relations with some of the Powhatans, learning from each other's ways and building bridges of understanding. An English colony was finally able to be established on American soil. While Jamestown was burgeoning as a colony, merchant William Hawkins was sent to establish trade in India. In 1607, he sailed from the port of Plymouth, England aboard the Hector, accompanied by a fleet of 3 ships. The crew was a mix of experienced sailors, traders, and diplomats, carrying various goods to trade with distant lands. After a perilous voyage fraught with storms and rough seas, the fleet arrived at the Cape of Good Hope in South Africa, marking a significant milestone in their journey. They entered the vast Indian Ocean and made their way towards the western coast of India. Hawkins arrived in the port of Surat in 1608, one of the most important trading centers on the Indian west coast. The Mughal Emperor Jahangir, who ruled over a vast empire, showed a keen interest in foreign trade and welcomed the English visitors. Hawkins' first meeting with Emperor Jahangir occurred in Agra, near the famous Taj Mahal. Through skilled interpreters, they engaged in discussions about trade, politics, and culture. The emperor was intrigued by the English goods and desired further interaction and trade with England. The negotiations between Hawkins and the Mughal emperor resulted in a favorable agreement, granting the English East India Company the privilege to establish a trading post in Surat. This marked the official beginning of England's trade relations with India. By 1612, the Surat trading post was an entire operation, where the English would begin trading for various Indian goods, such as textiles, spices, and indigo, in exchange for English weapons and metalware. In 1615, an English diplomat of the name Sir Thomas Roe arrived at the Grand Court of Emperor Jahangir of the Mughal Emperor. As Sir Thomas Roe stepped into the opulent halls of the Mughal court, he was greeted with a display of cultural grandeur unmatched in the West. The colorful fabrics, the exquisite jewelry, and the sweet aroma of incense filled the air. The English envoy was mesmerized by the splendor of the Mughal Empire. Amidst the regal surroundings, Sir Thomas Roe presented King James I's letter to Emperor Jahangir, a token of goodwill and friendship. In return, he gave a collection of rare English goods, marveling at the Mughal appreciation for luxurious commodities. Over the 3 years Roe spent in Jahangir's court, England increased trade and influence in the lands of India. While back in England, King James made his religious expectations very clear. Everyone must be Anglican. If you do not comply, leave. That's when the idea of America came to spark in their minds. A place where they can openly practice whatever they choose without any say by the government. If one wanted to practice a religion, they could. Of course, most people wouldn't leave their homes for an unknown place if they weren't genuinely convicted of their beliefs. Only the most faithful and those who genuinely desire religious freedom would dare go on this voyage. The people who did were called pilgrims. So, in mid-July 1620, the English Mayflower ship and the Dutch Speedwell ship were set to depart from Southampton. But yet, shortly after the crews were about to depart, the Speedwell sprung up a leak, forcing it to return to Dartmouth for repairs. They made a new start after the repairs, but more than 200 miles beyond Land's End, at the southwestern tip of England, Speedwell sprang another leak. It was now early September, and they had no choice but to abandon Speedwell and decide on which passengers. However, this decision was not easy because while the Speedwell was making repairs, the other pilgrims on the Mayflower were eating all of the rations that were supposed to last until they made it to the New World. During the time of repair, the passengers never left the ship. After 3 months of delay, the Mayflower sailed from Plymouth, England alone on September 16, 1620. The chances of the Mayflower making it to the New World was low, because it was built to transport wine between England and Bordeaux, not across the Atlantic Ocean. Yet they were driven by a purpose, the purpose of creating a new civilization for God. Their beliefs gave the passengers strength to crouch in semi-darkness below deck. With waves tossing the boat in different directions, men held onto their wives, who themselves had onto their children. Water was soaking everyone and everything above and below the deck. In mid-ocean, the ship came close to being totally disabled and may have had to return to England or risk sinking. A storm badly damaged its main beam that even the sailors despaired. By a stroke of luck, one of the colonists had a metal jackscrew he had purchased in Holland to help construct the new settler homes. They used it to secure the beam, which kept it from cracking further, thus maintaining the vessel's seaworthiness. Despite the crowding, unsanitary conditions, and seasickness, they somehow made it to Cape Cod on November 21st, with only one fatality, establishing the colony of Plymouth. However, their luck will soon fade, because by December, most of the passengers had become ill, coughing violently and suffering from the effects of scurvy. By March, only 47 colonists had survived, but yet the Pilgrims were resilient people who could build houses and didn't die off completely. Shortly after the establishment of Plymouth, explorer Thomas Warner wanted to grow the empire down to the tropical Caribbean islands. On January 28, 1624, they landed on the island and established the colony of St. Christopher, which is now called St. Kitts today. In 1625, French captain Pierre Ballon de Sonnebouc joined the English and established a joint colony between the two countries. The reason Warner accepted the newcomers was nothing but benevolent. He was beginning to fear the native Kalingo tribe of the Carib people. Kalingo leader Ubito Tegramonte held a secret meeting in 1626 with the other heads and decided to attack the Europeans on the night of the next full moon. The plan was revealed to the Europeans by an Igneri woman named Barb. She was recently brought to St. Kitts as a slave wife after the Kalingo raided an Arawak island. The English and French joined forces and attacked the Kalinago at night. The colonists killed between 100 and 120 Caribs in their beds that night, with only the most beautiful Kalinago women spared to serve as slaves. The following day, the French and British settlers rounded up the roughly 4,000 Kalinago natives and killed them while attempting to surrender. After the massacre, piles and piles of dead, rotting bodies lingered throughout the point. The Bloody Point. The river was red with blood. The Bloody River. The remaining Kalinago people fled to neighboring islands. With all of the Kalinago people dead, a nasty problem has arrived. Who was supposed to do the labor-intensive tobacco farming? It wasn't going to be the Europeans. Instead, they looked to Africa, and thus the slave trade was in high demand. While the English weren't done colonizing in the Caribbean, in 1625, they settled in Barbados. In 1627, they had Nevis. In 1632, they settled in Montserrat and Antigua. The British were not going anyway, and they were determined to make a profit in the Caribbean. While back in England, the religious atmosphere for extreme religious groups looked bleak for the Puritans. When King Charles I had ascended the throne in 1625, he doubled down on his hatred for non-Anglicans. His atmosphere of intolerance led Puritan religious and business leaders to consider immigration to the New World as a viable means to escape persecution. In March 1629, King Charles dissolved Parliament, beginning 11 years of rule without it. The Puritans were livid. They wanted freedom, yet Charles was a dictator. That's why, under the leadership of Minister John Winthrop, they've decided to leave. On April 8, 1630, 11 ships left the Isle of Wight, carrying Winthrop and 700 other settlers. When the settlers landed in Salem, Massachusetts later that year, John Winthrop gave a sermon, a model of Christian charity that would change American history. The Massachusetts Bay Colony wasn't just another money-making expedition like Jamestown or St. Kitts. They viewed themselves as the people who would change the world. Their strict moral code would impress upon God and shine them to the center of history. Throughout the next 10 years, about 20,000 Puritans emigrated from England to Massachusetts and the neighboring colonies during the Great Migration. However, due to the sudden influx of Puritan settlers and slight religious differences, they migrated all across New England. Thomas Hooker established the Connecticut colony, while Thomas Williams established the colony of Rhode Island, allowing for the growth of the Puritan religion and creating more cities on a hill. The Puritans weren't the only ones struggling with Anglicanism. Cecil Calvert, the second Lord Baltimore, pursued an audacious plan. As the holder of the title, he was granted a charter by King Charles I in 1632 for lands in the New World. This charter recognized his right to establish a colony north of Virginia, which he named Maryland in honor of the Catholic Queen, Henrietta Maria. Cecil Calvert never set foot in Maryland, but his influence was deeply felt. Under his guidance in 1634, two ships, the Ark and the Dove, carried the first settlers across the Atlantic. These pioneers, a mix of Catholics seeking religious freedom and Protestants hoping for economic opportunities, established the colony's first settlement, St. Mary's City. While the Americans weren't the ones struggling with Anglicanism, even though Scotland was neighbors with the English, they had their own religious traditions called the Presbyterian Church of Scotland. While King Charles I was focused on converting Scotland to Anglicanism, the Scottish Covenanter army was ready to defend. As Charles sent 20,000 soldiers to Edinburgh, he could not penetrate the Scottish army of 16,500 men in the border town of Berwick. Charles joined his troops at Berwick on May 30th, 1639, announcing he would not invade Scotland as long as the Scottish Covenanter army remained 10 miles north of the border. For now, there will be peace in Scotland. While across the world in India, the British East India Company was growing in influence. Trade between the sects of the world was eclipsing what the rest of Europe intended. This created the desire for a tiny parcel of land within the Indian subcontinent. So in 1639, the British East India Company dispatched two of its agents, Francis Day and Andrew Cogan, to the shores of the Coromandel coast. Day and Cogan arrived in the bustling port of Masulipatam, a central trading hub of the Vijayanagara Empire. They came with ambitions to establish a foothold in the region to secure their trade interests and compete with other European powers vying for control over these lucrative waters. Negotiations with the local Nayak rulers were complex. After months of discussions and an exchange of gifts, a deal was struck. The British East India Company secured a tract of land, a mere stretch of coastal dunes and palm trees, which they intended to develop into a trading post. The company could have spent more time with a modest parcel of land under their control. They began constructing a humble trading post consisting of a few warehouses and shelters for traders. The initial goal was to facilitate the exchange of goods, primarily textiles, spices, and precious metals, between the Indian subcontinent and England. The site was named Fort St. George as a nod to England's patron saint, St. George. The name held religious significance and underscored the company's intent to establish a lasting presence. As trade flourished, so did the security concerns. The shifting alliances and rivalries among European powers in the region, such as the Portuguese and Dutch, prompted the company to rethink the nature of its trading post. The simple structures began to transform into more substantial buildings, and defensive walls started to encircle the settlement. This transformation was more than just a matter of protection. It was a tangible manifestation of the company's growing ambitions. Fort St. George was becoming more than just a trading post. It was a strategic center of influence. While back in the Isle of Ireland, the Irish Catholics were forced to give up their lands to British and Scottish settlers. These lands were redistributed to English-speaking Protestants, with the remainder going to deserving native Irish lords and clans. So naturally, this led to an Irish rebellion in 1641. A faction of the Irish gentry, led by figures like Rory O'More and Sir Phelim O'Neill, attempted a coup in Dublin. The plan was to seize Dublin Castle, a symbol of English power, but the plot was discovered, forcing the conspirators to act prematurely, leading to ultimate failure. However, O'Neill and the Catholics were not done. In November 1641, the rebels tried to attack the town of Lisnagarvey, but failed. Upset and angry, they lashed out in Portadown, a town that was once home to the McCann clan, that was now resettled with new settlers. The Irish forces managed to overpower the British defenses, and in the aftermath, anger got the best of the British. On that chilling day, the Irish forced the Protestant prisoners to a wooden bridge that was intentionally broken in the middle. The Protestant prisoners were stripped and forced off the bridge into the cold river below. Those who tried to swim to safety were shot with muskets. It's estimated that around 100 settlers met this grim fate at the bridge, their cries echoing long after the waters had silenced them. In retaliation, in Island Magee, 24 Catholics were murdered in retaliation. The arrival of a Scottish Covenanter army in Ulster in April 1642 led to further such atrocities. On Rathlin Island, Scottish soldiers from Clan Campbell were encouraged by their commanding officer, Sir Duncan Campbell, to kill the local Catholic MacDonalds, who were related to the Campbells' enemies in Scotland, Clan MacDonald. They threw hundreds of MacDonald women over cliffs to their deaths. The killings were brought under some degree of control by Owen Roe O'Neill, who in July 1642 was given command of Irish forces in Ulster and hanged several rebels for attacking civilians. There was no unity among the Catholic leaders. They all acted upon their will. In order to win a war, you need to work together. So that's when all the Catholic leaders met in Kilkelly, where the Confederate Catholics of Ireland were born. Their goal was clear: to create an Irish Catholic state loyal to the English King Charles I, but autonomous in its functioning, because they knew it was their best chance for peace. The Confederation crafted its own governmental structure. an assembly to debate and make decisions, a council to oversee administrative functions, and a military arm to protect their interests. One of the Confederation's defining moments was the creation of an oath. This oath symbolized their dual loyalty to the Catholic Church and King Charles I. Members swore to uphold the rights of the Church in Ireland, ensuring its prominence and protection. Within a few months of the rebellion's outbreak, almost all Catholic gentry joined it. Local lords and landowners raised armed units of their dependents to control the violence that engulfed the country, fearing that after the settlers were gone, the Irish peasantry would also turn on them. Secondly, the Long Parliament, the Irish administration, and King Charles made it clear that Irish Catholics who did not demonstrate their loyalty would be held responsible for the rebellion and killings of settlers and would confiscate their lands as stated in the Adventures Act of 1642. This apparent act of appeasement would not last though, as the British Isles were now at war. On the fateful day of January 4, 1642, King Charles attempted to arrest 5 members of Parliament. These 5 members, John Pym, John Hampden, Denzil Hollis, Arthur Hasselrig, and William Strode, were known for opposing the king's policies and support for parliamentary rights. Charles I accused them of treason and other offenses, which led to a standoff between the king and Parliament. On June 4, 1642, Parliament members sent a demand letter to King Charles called the 19 Propositions, which would reform how Parliament and the monarchy would work. Parliament would grow in power if passed, while the monarchy would be weakened. Within the propositions, Parliament is demanding various line items, such as number 2, matters that concern the public must be debated in Parliament, not decided based upon the advice of private advisors. 6. Laws against Jesuits, Catholic priests, and Catholic recusants must be strictly enforced. 7. The vote of Catholic lords shall be taken away, and the children of Catholics must receive a Protestant education. 18. Charles must clear the 5 members of the House of Commons, along with Lord Kimbolton, of any wrongdoing. Though the Catholics in the Irish Confederation may be loyal to Charles, Parliament was angered by Charles's blatant disregard for the Anglican Church, so they demanded he change his stance. In response, Charles would write, "For all these reasons to all these demands, our answer is nolumus leges Angliae mutari. We are unwilling to change the laws of England." With tensions escalating, both sides began to gather support and muster their forces. By autumn, the rolling countryside near Edgehill became the stage for a pivotal clash between the royalist forces loyal to King Charles I and the parliamentarian troops supporting the cause of parliamentary supremacy. As the sun rose on October 23rd, the two sides arrayed against each other in a tense and charged atmosphere. The royalist cavalry, led by Prince Rupert of the Rhine, was known for their daring and fearless charges. On the opposite, Robert Devereux, the Earl of Essex, a seasoned general, commanded the parliamentarians. Rupert's cavaliers launched a ferocious charge that shattered the parliamentarian left flank as the battle commenced. The royalists gained the upper hand. However, the royalist infantry was unable to capitalize on the cavalry's success. The parliamentarian forces, while in disarray, managed to regroup and counterattack. The battle raged with fierce hand-to-hand combat, pitting brother against brother and friend against friend. But yet, after 2 days of fighting, there was no decisive winner. The war was set in motion, with neither side willing to relent. The following year, the Royalists, buoyed by early optimism, tasted victory. In the south, at Braddock Down, they swiftly defeated the parliamentarians. Further success followed at Stratton, consolidating their hold over Cornwall. Riding this wave, Prince Rupert showcased his military prowess at Chalgrove Field, even though the event was marred by the death of the parliamentarian icon, John Hampden. The Royalist cause seemed unstoppable, and this was further confirmed with their victories at Adwalden Moor and Roundway Down. By the end of the year, even the key city of Bristol had fallen into their hands. However, 1644 marked a shift. The parliamentarians, learning from their defeats, mounted a challenge. Their efforts culminated at Marston Moor, a vast expanse that bore witness to a dramatic turnaround. Here, under the watchful eyes of generals like Oliver Cromwell, the Royalist forces faced a crushing defeat, relinquishing their grip over the north. Later that year, the two sides met again at the First Battle of Newbury. Much like Edgehill, neither could claim an outright win. However, a turning point was on the horizon: the Battle of Naseby. As dawn broke on June 14, 1645, a palpable tension filled the air. Both armies faced each other a mere few miles apart. The Royalists, confident and seasoned from earlier victories, anticipated another win. The Parliamentarians, however, had been reorganizing and were now more formidable than ever, especially with Oliver Cromwell's new model army, a force known for its discipline and strategic prowess. The battle commenced with the customary roar of cannons, sending plumes of smoke into the morning sky. Initially, the Royalists seemed to have the upper hand, with their horsemen charging effectively against the Parliamentarian flanks. But Cromwell, with his strategic acumen, had a card up his sleeve: his Ironsides, a cavalry regiment known for its staunch discipline and unwavering courage. As the Royalist cavalry believed they were gaining ground, they were met with a fierce countercharge by the Ironsides. The Parliamentarians, with resounding shouts and unparalleled coordination, began to turn the tide. Cromwell's forces pushed back, cutting through the Royalist ranks, capturing King Charles himself and making him a prisoner. Charles was later put on trial for high treason. In Westminster Hall, Charles I defended his actions, but the trial ended with a guilty verdict. On a winter morning, the fallen monarch faced the executioner's blade, marking the shift from absolutism to a new era of governance, the era of Oliver Cromwell. Oliver Cromwell was a Puritan and, like his brethren in Massachusetts, believed that the Anglican Church was corrupted by Charles and the way of the Royalists. So, in the new parliament known as the Rump Parliament, Cromwell was able to be a general to attack the Irish Confederacy. In his mind, the Catholic belief was denying the primacy of the Bible and needed to be quelled. After he landed in Dublin on August 15, 1649, Cromwell took the fortified port towns of Drogheda and Wexford to secure logistical supplies from England. At the Siege of Drogheda in September 1649, his troops killed nearly 3,500 people after the town's capture. Around 2,700 Royalist soldiers, including some civilians, prisoners, and Roman Catholic priests. In October, another massacre took place in Wexford and killed 2,000 Irish troops and 1,500 Irish civilians. Wexford was burned to ashes. Cromwell left Ireland in May 1650 after Scotland proclaimed Charles II, the son of Charles I, to be king. With this act of so-called treason, Cromwell felt the only action was war. On September 3, 1650, unexpectedly, Cromwell smashed the main Scottish army at the Battle of Dunbar, killing 4,000 Scottish soldiers, taking another 10,000 prisoners, and then capturing the Scottish capital of Edinburgh. The following year, Charles II and his Scottish allies attempted to invade England and capture London, while Cromwell was engaged in Scotland. Cromwell followed them south and caught them at Worcester on September 3, 1651, and his forces destroyed the last major Scottish Royalist army at the Battle of Worcester. Under the generals Henry Ireton and Edmund Ludlow back in Ireland, the Irish were sieged into oblivion. The last Catholic-held town, Galway, surrendered in April 1652. And the latest Irish Catholic troops capitulated in April 1653 in County Cavan. In the wake of the Commonwealth's conquest of the island of Ireland, the public practice of Roman Catholicism was banned, and Catholic priests were killed when captured. All Catholic-owned land was confiscated under the Act for the Settlement of Ireland of 1652, and given to Scottish and English settlers, Parliament's financial creditors, and parliamentary soldiers. Presbyterianism was deemed illegal in Scotland, and they were forced to be a part of the Anglican Church. Oliver Cromwell was decorated as Lord Protectorate in 1653. With his position, he tried to make the rest of the British Isles more like England. He hated the Scottish clan system up in the partial jungle of the Highlands, so he destroyed it. Before Cromwell, there was no idea of land ownership in the Highlands. A clan would live on the land, and together they would survive off the resources communally. Together, they would have a chief. However, that would often change. However, Cromwell gave the titles of land to these chiefs, saying that they individually owned the land rather than the whole group. This, in turn, created a Scottish noble class of those who arbitrarily got the deed to the land and built a castle of impoverished, non-land-owning Scotsmen. This changed the entire function of Scottish society. The landowners wanted to make a profit rather than survive as a community. Following English ideals, the landowners wanted to make as much profit as humanly possible. So they started cutting down giant swaths of Scottish trees. This once prospering rainforest turned into a hilly, grassy field seemingly overnight. Then came the sheep. Over time, with these bare grass mountainous fields, the landowners realized they could make more profit by raising sheep than by farming. So, sheep were given endless land to graze, while the old clan members were forced to work parts of the land and were impoverished. Cromwell thought that making Scotland more English would be more civilized and enlightened, that English society is just so perfect that it must be spread all across the world to truly help those people who live in a world filled with cultural differences, that the English way is the only way. Cromwell thought he was doing Scotland a favor, but some see it as he ruined their entire society instead. He wouldn't be the last Brit to do just that. While most of Cromwell focused on the British Isles, he still wanted to have control against the Spanish in South America. So, he launched the Western Design Armada in the Caribbean. In April 1655, General Robert Venables led the English Armada in an attack on Spain's fort at Santo Domingo, Hispaniola. However, the Spanish quickly defended against this poorly executed siege of Santo Domingo, and the English troops were soon decimated by disease. Venables, not wanting to be a failure, went to the only Spanish colony in the area that did not have defensive capabilities, the sparsely populated island of Jamaica. In May 1655, around 7,000 English soldiers landed near Jamaica's Spanish town capital. The English invasion force soon overwhelmed the 2,500 residents, and it became an English colony. Of course, the Spanish wanted to regain the island, but were ultimately never able to gain a foothold in the island. Cromwell used the island to send prisoners of war and anyone who disobeyed his rule by making them indentured servants, forced to help grow the island's sugarcane production. However, tropical disease and harsh conditions made it hard for the colony to grow. In the year 1660, the reign of Cromwell was over, and the colonization race was on under new leadership. King Charles II was given power, and the British monarchy was restored. Charles II was dead set on bringing England to the rest of the world. In Africa, he established the Company of Royal Adventures trading into Africa. Charles II granted the company a complete monopoly of the gold trade and, in 1663, access to the ever-lucrative slave trade. While in the Americas, Charles established the Province of Carolina, which he named after himself. The charter gave 8 English nobles land access to lands that were part of modern-day Alabama, Florida, Georgia, Mississippi, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Tennessee. It was set up to be a buffer between the growing Spanish land grab and the swamps of Florida. Back in Africa, the English weren't the only ones trying to pillage Africa for their resources. The Dutch had established many settlements across the lucrative coast, and the English did not like it. Captain Robert Holmes was given authority to take over any Dutch fort he could. So, on January 22, 1664, he took the fort of Gorée. On March 28th, he took over Walcheren. On April 10th, he captured the principal Dutch base, Cape Coast Castle, in West Africa. Slightly after, in America, the English were looking to overtake the Dutch colony of New Amsterdam, situated on the southern tip of Manhattan. On May 25, 1664, Colonel Richard Nichols set out from Portsmouth with 4 warships and 300 soldiers. When they arrived on August 27th, he sent Dutch Director-Governor Peter Stuyvesant a letter of lenient terms of surrender. The Dutch colonists would still be guaranteed possession of their property rights, enjoyment of religious freedom, and that all pubs would remain open. They would not have to follow the puritanical rules of Massachusetts. Rather, they would be their own colony. The people of New Amsterdam accepted, and the colony was renamed to New York. The Dutch in Europe were unhappy with this English conquering, so they sent out experienced naval Lieutenant Admiral Michael de Ruyter to defeat the English. First, he started in Africa, where he quickly reconquered all former Dutch forts the English conquered, except Cape Coast. After that, he sailed over to the Americas. In April 1665, he arrived off the coast of Barbados, destroying various English ships on the way. However, his army was weakened, and even though he was ordered to retake New York, he knew that his fleet could not handle it. Fighting that battle would result in imminent death, so in 1665, he went back to the Netherlands. In 1667, the Treaty of Breda was signed, where the English would have an absolute claim of the former New Netherlands, while the Dutch would regain control of the colony Suriname, which is in South America. With the Netherlands out of the picture, the path to further colonization in the Americas was at its forefront, but it wasn't without its controversies. Because up in the no-man's land of Canada lay the unambitious French colony of Montreal. The French were more hesitant to expand outside their predefined areas. They had their places where they would hunt furs, and they were to stay on that path. The French sustained all their colonial efforts from fur trading, which was in high demand in Europe. However, 2 French fur traders, Pierre Esprit Radisson and Maître de Grossières, learned from the native Cree peoples that the ultimate place for premium fur pellets was in the north and west of Lake Superior. The duo knew their opportunity, and if they wanted to be rich, they would have to go against the will of the French. As they set off into this mysterious land, most thought they wouldn't make it. But when they returned a year later to Montreal with premium furs, evidence of the potential of the Hudson Bay region, they were arrested by French authorities for trading without a license and fined, and their furs were confiscated by the government. Determined to establish trade in the Hudson Bay area, Radisson and Grossier approached a group of English colonial merchants in Boston, Massachusetts, to help finance their explorations. Eventually, the two met and gained the sponsorship of Prince Rupert, the cousin of King Charles II. In 1668, the English expedition acquired 2 ships, the Nonsuch and the Eaglet, to explore possible trade into Hudson Bay. Grossier sailed on the Nonsuch, commanded by Captain Zachariah Gillam, while the Eaglet was commanded by Captain William Stannard and accompanied by Radisson. On June 5, 1668, both ships left port at Deptford, England, but the Eaglet was forced to turn back off the coast of Ireland. The Nonsuch continued to James Bay, the southern portion of Hudson Bay, where its explorers founded in 1668 the first fort on Hudson Bay, Charles Fort, at the mouth of the Rupert River. After a successful trading expedition over the winter of 1669, Nonsuch returned to England on October 9, 1669, with the first cargo of fur resulting from trade in Hudson Bay. The bulk of this haul was sold to London's most prominent furrier, Thomas Glover, for £1,233. Calculating for inflation, the value of the furs would be worth $188,000 in today's pounds. After establishing viability and profitability in the company, King Charles II granted a monopoly over the region drained by all rivers and streams flowing into Hudson Bay to the Hudson Bay Company, a company that still exists today. While back in New England, the English colonies started to grow at an increasingly accelerated rate. In 1624, the Massachusetts Bay Colony only was home to 180 people. Now, in 1675, it was the home of 64,000. With more people, the demand for more space, resources, and food increased. So, the colonists began expanding outside their tiny settlements to produce what they needed. Their de facto capital, Plymouth, was right in the center of the ancestral lands of the Wampanoag Confederacy, a Native American tribe. At first, the Wampanoag were friendly towards pilgrims, but their relationship began to sour over time. They tried to negotiate territorial boundaries. However, their fundamental differences in how land and property worked made it nearly impossible. The English viewed land as something an individual with the right deed could own, while the natives believed land was a communal resource to be shared for all. So, when the English tried to buy land from the natives, it was met with confusion and a lack of understanding. For all the Wampanoag knew, their new neighbors stole their land unjustly. In 1675, a single event ignited the powder keg. 3 Wampanoag men were executed by English authorities accused of the murder of a Christianized Native American named John Sassamon. This series of executions caused outrage among the Wampanoags, led by Metacom, with the English name of King Philip. Metacom led his warriors and attacked the Plymouth colony, starting at Swansea and going to Taunton, Brookfield, and Deerfield. The winter months did little to quell the conflict. Both sides endured harsh conditions, facing disease, starvation, and exposure. Battles raged, with Native American tribes joining Metacom's alliance against the colonists. The English launched counterattacks, leading to the infamous Battle of Great Swamp, where a Narragansett fort was captured with heavy casualties on both sides. As the conflict escalated, alliances shifted like sand in the wind. English authorities negotiated a treaty with the Mohawk tribe, hoping to gain a strategic advantage against Metacom's forces. Native American villages were razed, lives lost, and families torn apart. Metacom's leadership kept the alliance together, but his death in 1676 marked a turning point. He was assassinated by one of his best friends, John Alderman, who was known as the Praying Indian because of his Christian beliefs. With Metacom's death, the Native American alliance faltered, resistance dwindled, and the war began to wind down. In August 1676, the war officially ended, leaving both Native American communities and English settlements devastated. Lives were lost, property destroyed, and cultures forever altered. The war ended with the Treaty of Casco, which allowed the English to remain on all native lands. However, they were required to pay a light tribute of 1 peck of corn per English family settled on native land. A peck is equivalent to 2 dry gallons, or 16 dry pints, a relatively insignificant amount for the farmers of Massachusetts Bay. While back in England, another religious group was challenging the tenets of Anglicanism, the Quakers. One of their most controversial ideas was the concept of inner light, which states that there is a divine spark within each individual that allows for direct communication with God, without needing a state-appointed bishop or a king. They also rejected all formal titles, spanning from Your Highness to Mother. Every Quaker was to be referred to by their first name regardless of status. King Charles would be referred to as Charles. Quaker kids would call their mother by their first name. This mere concept of rejecting hierarchical titles put them on the outskirts of British society. So, William Penn made it his mission to find a place for his church to go. It also helped that King Charles II was indebted to William Penn's father for £16,000, or £2.8 million today. Instead of receiving cash, William Penn asked for land in the New World to house his fellow Quakers. On March 4, 1681, Charles signed the order, creating the colony of Pennsylvania. When William Penn arrived at his colony on the ship Welcome in October 1682, he went to a tiny settlement and named it in Greek Phileo Adelphos, which would translate into English, the city of brotherly love. A city where all people, regardless of race, creed, religion, or gender, could prosper. A place where no one would be unfairly prosecuted. A place, in theory, where a white man and a black man could shake hands as equals. As Penn would refer to it, this was a holy experiment, because he believed in a famous Quaker tenet that all people are equal under the eyes of God. However, the English Empire was in turmoil once again after King Charles II died in 1685. His successor, James II, was a staunch Roman Catholic who took the throne. He thought it was important to grant rights of religious freedom across the land. However, the Anglican majority were livid when James appointed Catholics to powerful positions, violating the Test Act, which made that very act illegal to do so. But the birth of an heir truly set the kingdom on edge. James's second wife, Mary of Modena, bore him a son, a Catholic heir who threatened to establish a line of monarchs devoted to the Catholic faith. Fears of a Catholic dynasty ran rampant, shaking the Protestant establishment's core. In the shadows, a group of nobles and political leaders known as the Immortal Seven whispered their concerns. They felt the kingdom was hurling towards absolutism, with the monarchy overshadowing the power of Parliament and the rule of law. They knew something had to be done to protect their beliefs. Their hopes turned to Prince William of Orange, James's Protestant son-in-law, to quell his father-in-law's desire for religious acceptance. In 1688, William's fleet sailed to the shores of England. His arrival was met with a surprising lack of resistance, as many of James's supporters defected to his side. James II's grasp on power weakened as his supporters dwindled. Fearing for his safety, he fled to France in the dead of night, leaving a kingdom in turmoil and an uncertain future. With the throne vacant, William and Mary, Protestantism's chosen protectors, accepted the leadership mantle. Parliament seized the moment to enact lasting change. In 1689, they passed the Bill of Rights, a cornerstone of constitutional principles that established the supremacy of Parliament over the monarchy, curbed the monarch's power, and protected individual rights. However, once the news spread to America, the Protestants were ready to revolt. In April 1689, news of the glorious revolution in England reached the American colonies. Protestant settlers in New York revolted against the Catholic governor, Jacob Leisler, seizing control of Fort James. They established a provisional government in the name of William and Mary. Around the same time in Massachusetts, the English in Boston overthrew the Catholic governor, Sir Edmund Andros, who had imposed unpopular policies. They arrested Andros and restored their previous political structure, declaring loyalty to William and Mary. The French Catholics, seeing this as an attack on their faith and the will of the papacy, decided to fight back. However, much to France's surprise, most of Europe was pinned against them. England, the Dutch Republic, the Holy Roman Empire, and Spain were all aligned to stop the French in what was referred to as the Grand Alliance. On a bloody day in 1690, the Battle of Fleurus saw the French secure victory against the Grand Alliance forces in the Spanish Netherlands. This battle solidified France's hold on key territories in the region. Across the seas in Ireland, the Battle of the Boyne marked a clash between the forces of the deposed Catholic King James II and those of his Protestant successor, King William III. William emerged victorious, securing his hold on the English and Irish thrones. However, the war was not just a European battle. It spanned the entire world. In 1690, a series of clashes erupted, including the Battle of Port Royal. English forces attempted to capture the French stronghold in Acadia, present-day Nova Scotia, but their efforts were thwarted. French and Abenaki forces launched raids against English settlements in the province of Maine, sowing fear and uncertainty among the settlers. Battles like the Siege of Pemaquid showcased the complexities of alliances, as indigenous tribes aligned with European powers to further their interests. In the Battle of Quebec saw an English expedition attempt to capture the critical French stronghold in Canada. Despite their efforts, the English forces were unsuccessful in their endeavor, creating a firm boundary between the two nations' colonies. On September 20th, 1697, the Treaty of Ryswick was signed, marking the end of the 9 Years' War. In this treaty, it was officially declared that William of Orange was the leader of England. It also stopped the French offensive. While the 9-year was underway in Europe and the Americas, the English were in their first war in India, because at the time, the English East India Company had a trade monopoly in the area. The company wanted to obtain ownership of Chittagong, establish a fortified enclave throughout the region, and attain independence of the surrounding Soba from the Mughal territory by bringing the local governors and the Hooghly River to their control. However, Mughal Emperor Aurangzeb refused these desired English terms. So, the East India Company Navy blockaded several Mughal ports on the western coast of India and engaged the Mughal army in battle. The blockade started to affect cities like Chittagong, Madras, and Bombay, which resulted in the intervention of Emperor Aurangzeb, who seized all the factories of the company and arrested members of the East India Company army. In 1690, the Mughal fleet from Hindhira, commanded by Sidi Yaqub, blockaded the East India Company fort in Bombay. After a year of resistance and famine in the fort, the company surrendered, and the company sent envoys to Aurangzeb's court to plead for a pardon and to renew the trade. The company's envoys had to prostrate themselves before the emperor paid a hefty imperial fine of 150,000 rupees, the equivalent of 4.4 million today. Emperor Aurangzeb then ordered Sidi Yaqub to lift the siege of Bombay, and the company subsequently re-established itself in Bombay and set up a new base in Calcutta. While back over in England, when Queen Anne took over for William in 1702, the structure of the government within the British Isles was quite unique. There were 4 kingdoms, 3 parliaments, and 1 monarch. Scotland had their own parliament and set of laws, while they were still under the power of the British monarch. Ireland also had their own parliament with statutes and still abiding the British monarch. England and Wales shared a parliament, as Wales was more assimilated into English culture. That, of course, still followed the British monarch. In 1707, though, Scotland was dealing with the economic turmoil of corruption, resource depletion, and an increasingly powerful elite. The wealthy knew that they could increase their power if they combined Parliament. Many Scottish officials were bribed, such as Earl of Glasgow, David Boyle, and 2nd Duke of Queensberry, James Douglas, who received around £20,000, £4 million today, to end the Scottish Parliament. The poor hated this, but they were ignored. So on May 1st, 1707, the Scottish and English Parliament combined to form the Parliament of Great Britain, based in the Palace of Westminster, which housed the Old English Parliament. As any semblance of Scottish independence was gone, anger spread throughout Scotland, but nothing was done about it. However, for England, this uniting of Parliament created the term Great Britain, was the beginning of the empire. Though the Treaty of Ryswick was designed to keep the peace between England and France, it was short-lived. In 1707, they were again fighting over the colonies in America due to a succession issue in Spain. The Spanish King Charles II was dying of ill health without any children. 2 rival claims emerged to seize the Spanish crown: Archduke Charles of Austria, a Habsburg scion, and Philip of Anjou, a Bourbon prince and possible successor to France's King Louis XIV. The English feared a united French and Spanish throne because it would increase Catholicism's power worldwide. So the English staunchly declared war. Even though this war started about who should be king of Spain, it ended by restructuring European colonization. The first battle on American soil was in Fort Albany, where French commander Claude de Ramsay and his men wanted to knock out the English trading post. Fort Albany's wooden walls and palisades stood as barriers, separating the defenders from the impending storm. Inside the fort, English traders and soldiers braced for the confrontation that was about to unfold. But the fort was no match to heavy French cannon fire and was later surrendered to the French. However, the English weren't done, because English and French settlers wrestled over territorial boundaries in the rugged wilderness of Acadia. Upon leaving England, commanders Francis Nicholson and Samuel Vetch came to Acadia to gain the territory for the crown. Upon the rocky shores of Port Royal, the battle for dominance unfolded. English warships loomed on the horizon, their cannons primed and ready. The colonial troops, resolute in purpose, embarked upon a siege of the French stronghold. Within the fortifications, Governor Daniel Dogger de Subercase led a valiant French garrison. Days turned to nights as the siege pressed on, the thud of cannonballs and the roar of muskets reverberating through the air. Amid the chaos, negotiations began. On a crisp October day, white flags of truce fluttered above the ramparts. Governor Subercase, recognizing the inevitable, surrendered. On October 5, 1710, the gates of Port Royal swung open, and the English entered victorious. The French colors lowered, replaced by the Union Jack. Acadia, once French, was now under English control. Annapolis Royal it was named, a tribute to the queen whose reign witnessed this turning point in history. As the war was ending, the Treaty of Utrecht was signed in the Netherlands, declaring King Philip V the rightful king of the Spanish throne. However, the other provision, the Asiento de Negros, gave the English immense economic power. For context, the Spanish were never really the people who went through the process of transferring enslaved people from Africa. Instead, they exported the labor of it in a monopoly called Asiento de Negros. Before the treaty, the French had the contract, but part of the peace deal, that contract went to the English, so they could be a leader in the lucrative and dehumanizing practice of the transatlantic slave trade. The treaty caused the French to cede the territories of Nova Scotia, Newfoundland, and territories in Rupert's Land in North America. The Spanish ceded the colonies of Gibraltar and Minorca in the Caribbean. While global politics were being discussed in the Netherlands, the Carolinas reshaped their society. Instead of being one united Carolina, they split up into a North and South Carolina. South Carolina was fertile, great for sugarcane production, and had access to more raw materials. North Carolina, on the other hand, was slightly less fertile and economically less valuable. So, South Carolina became a jewel for the British Empire, which led to the need for more and more production of raw goods. To produce these goods, they needed to increase their power over slaves. So, in 1712, South Carolina passed the notorious Slave Codes of 1712. Though it is quite hard to hear, this nasty document outlined the viewpoints of slave-owning colonists and what they felt they had the right to do. The code states, Negroes and other slaves brought unto the people of this province for that purpose are of barbarous, wild, savage natures, and such as renders them wholly unqualified to be governed by the laws, customs, and practices of this province. This code created a quite harsh set of rules that included practices such as slaves were forbidden to leave the owner's property unless they were accompanied by a white person or had permission. If a slave leaves the owner's property without permission, every white person is required to chastise, whip, such slaves. Any slave attempting to run away and leave the colony receives the death penalty. Any slave who evades capture for 20 days or more is to be publicly whipped for the first offense, branded with the letter R on the right cheek for the second offense, and lose one ear if absent for 30 days for the third offense, and castrated for the fourth offense. This code became the forefront of slave treatment within the American colonies and the rest of the world. To the people of Carolinas, slaves were nothing more than tools for farmland to make a profit for their owners. At the time, though, there were approximately 40,000 slaves in North America. However, down south in the Caribbean islands of Barbados, Jamaica, and the Leeward Islands, the need for slaves in British colonies grew exponentially because of the profitable yet labor-intensive crop of sugarcane. To cultivate a simple stalk of sugarcane, first slaves would have to clear the space of all other vegetation in 100+ degree heat, 38 degrees Celsius, to create a clear farming surface. Then, you had to put little sugarcane stalks into the soil repeatedly. Once planted, slaves would have to weed, hoe, and maintain the crops on a massive plantation that spanned hundreds of acres. Slaves would also have to build canals to ensure the sugarcane was adequately hydrated, while they barely had enough to drink. Then, after 12 to 18 months, slaves used machetes to cut off the stalks and farm an adult sugarcane. This process was so physically grueling, as they were often malnourished, overheated, and forced to work 18-hour-plus days, that slaves would die left and right. That's why the English would enslave and transport around 200,000 Africans from 1710 to 1720 to the Americans, so they could always have fresh labor. Sugar doesn't always taste that sweet. While back in England, James Oglethorpe wanted to create a colony home to the worthy poor, individuals who struggled financially in England so that they could have a fresh start overseas. English citizens convicted of owing debt had a choice: go to prison, or go to the swamps of Georgia. In November 1732, 144 colonists, including Oglethorpe, boarded the Anne and Gravesend English and sailed to Savannah on February 12, 1733. Unlike their neighbors in the Carolinas, Georgia banned all slavery in the colony. Instead of having these massive plantations, Georgians would farm their own small farms, where they could make enough food for their families. Oglethorpe wanted the colonists to create a comfortable living but not be incredibly wealthy. The other main fear of introducing slavery would be that the Spanish colony of Florida offered freedom to any African slave who went to their border and joined their army. If slavery was permitted, there would be very little to stop the slaves from feeding the Spanish army and expanding their American interests. However, that wouldn't stop the two nations from going to war, because before Georgia was even a colony in 1731, British merchant Robert Jenkins was notorious for raiding Spanish ships and stealing their resources. One day, a Spanish privateer captured Jenkins and, as punishment, severed his ear. Jenkins then proceeded to present the ear to Parliament, and the outraged English demanded retribution. For 8 years, the two nations tried to solve this conflict peacefully, but in January 1740, Oglethorpe and his men invaded and seized two Spanish forts, Fort Picolata and Fort San Francisco de Pupo. The Georgian general wanted to go further in Florida and capture Fort St. Augustine, but quickly realized he didn't have enough forces and retreated back to Georgia. All Oglethorpe could do was fortify and prepare for the incoming invasion. That assault came in the summer of 1742. After landing on the southern tip of St. Simon's Island, the Spanish assembled to attack the English fort of Frederica. English Rangers encountered a scouting party, and Oglethorpe led the charge against the Spanish soldiers, who hastily fled the scene. While Oglethorpe returned to Frederica, his men fortified the road to the fort to prevent further incursions. A second skirmish ensued, an event later known as the Battle of Bloody Marsh, when the Spanish advanced another regiment. English forces sent the Spanish fleeing to the coastline, and from there, retreating to St. Augustine. The War of Jenkins' Ear wasn't just an American affair, it also spanned over to the Carnatic region of southern India. The English, with their Indian allies led by Anwaruddin, supported the claim to the Carnatic throne. On the other side, under the leadership of the ambitious Governor-General Dupleix, the French had forged an alliance with Chandos Sahib, a contender for the throne of the Carnatic. The tensions escalated in 1744 when a spark ignited the powder keg of colonial rivalry. The Battle of Ajar was a pivotal moment where the French defeated the English forces with their superior military tactics. It was a resounding victory for the French, and their influence in the Carnatic seemed unstoppable. Buoyed by their success, the French laid siege to the English-controlled city of Madras in 1746. The English, outnumbered and outmaneuvered, had no choice but to surrender the city to the triumphant French. But all of this was about to change because of the primary battle in the disputed territory of Austria. The Prussians, Dutch, Spanish, French, and independence movements claimed this territory. The English, not wanting to be left out of it, decided to ally with the Dutch and try to put them in power. In the summer of 1747, the Battle of Lafeld occurred, where the British, Dutch, and Austrian forces led by Duke Cumberland tried to infiltrate the French defense. However, they could not go through the French security, led by Maurice de Saxe, allowing the battle to end in stalemate. But nevertheless, diplomacy is sometimes where the real battles are fought. By the time all parties were done fighting in 1748, a favorable peace deal for the British emerged with the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle. They agreed to restore almost all territorial shifts to their pre-war status quo. This means Madras was back in English hands, even though they lost it in battle. The peace treaty also officially created an English and French border between Georgia and Florida, and the St. Johns River in the Americas. Also, Austria succeeded and became its own country under the leadership of Maria Theresa. After the war, in Georgia, the question of slavery was returned to the table. Oglethorpe remained adamant that slavery not be allowed. But with the unenforceable nature of the illegal importation of slaves from South Carolina, it quickly became a lost cause. The worthy poor didn't want to be poor, they wanted to be rich like their neighbors. So, on January 1st, 1751, slavery was permitted with a code almost identical to South Carolina's and passed. This change, though, ultimately hurt the worthy poor Oglethorpe designed Georgia to help, because the South Carolinian migrants enjoyed a significant wealth advantage over the original settlers of Georgia. They quickly established socio-economic structures and relationships nearly identical to those they had known in their colony. Within 20 years, some 60 planters who owned roughly half the colony's rapidly increasing enslaved population dominated the apex of low-country Georgia's rice economy. However, not all of America was a slave colony. In the forests of North America lay the Ohio Valley, a swath of 300,000 acres home to forests, fur pelts, and the opportunity to expand. Hence, the Ohio Company of Virginia was founded by Augustine Washington, George Washington's father, to find a way to make a profit from the natural landscape. A young George Washington was tasked with surveying and mapping the company's land holdings in the region. What he found, though, was concerning from a British perspective. The land was already home to the Shawnee and Delaware tribes, both of which were unhappy about the British expansion into the colony. The French were also present in the region with their lucrative fur trading business. The land was littered with French forts, such as the Fort Duquesne, constructed at the intersection of the Allegheny and Monongahela rivers in modern-day Pittsburgh. By April 1754, when tensions between the English and French were boiling, 22-year-old George Washington was sent out with a small detachment of troops determined to secure the valley. Deep in the heart of the wilderness, Washington's party stumbled upon a secluded glen known as Jumonville Glen. In this hidden grove, Washington's men stumbled upon a small French force, led by a man named Joseph Coulon de Jumonville, a French enlisted man. Tensions were high, and the forest was thick with suspense. No one knew what lay ahead. On the fateful morning of May 28, 1754, in a way clouded by the mysteries of war, Joseph was killed. The English would say his death occurred amid battle, but the French would say it was a calculated assassination attempt. The French, seeking revenge for the death of Jumonville, were incensed. They surrounded Washington and his men, who had retreated to a makeshift fort called Fort Necessity. Trapped and outnumbered, Washington was forced to surrender on July 3, 1754. Among the terms of surrender was Washington's acknowledgement that he had assassinated Jumonville. The ball of war was rolling. In Saxony, Europe, Prussian King Frederick II invaded Saxony, which put the world on notice as this bloody worldwide conflict began. The 7 Years' War was our planet's first world war. It expanded over 3 continents: the Americas, Europe, and India. The European powers were trying to gain control for their civilization to have worldwide influence, while the local nations were fighting for survival. The tides were shifting and the world was now completely global. The war did not start off great for the British when the governor of Bengal, Siraj-ud-Dowlah, captured Fort William in Calcutta, the home of the British East India Company. When the Bengalese soldiers entered the fort, they imprisoned 146 Englishmen into a tiny dungeon, where they were supposed to be transferred in the morning. However, these conditions were so appalling and dismal that, according to John Howell, one of the prisoners, 123 of the 146 people died in that dungeon. The smell of death reeked throughout the fort as they opened the door to the black hole of Calcutta. When the news got around, the English were determined to restore the fort and gain revenge on the victims of the black hole. However, their traction was quickly fleeting, and they needed to do anything to keep their foot on the wheel in India. That's when British officer Robert Clive rounded up his British soldiers to take down Siraj in the village of Plassey in Bengal. As the two armies faced each other on that fateful day in June, Siraj-ud-Dowlah held the advantage. His forces outnumbered Clive's, and the heat of the Indian sun bore down upon the battlefield. But appearances can be deceiving. Clive had a secret weapon in his arsenal: betrayal. He had forged alliances with local officials discontented with Siraj-ud-Dowlah's rule. Among them was Mir Jafar, a man with ambitions of his own. The battle began, and it quickly became apparent that Siraj-ud-Dowlah's forces were poorly coordinated. Meanwhile, Mir Jafar and his supporters were ready to make their move. As the battle raged, Mir Jafar's forces defected, turning the tide in favor of the British. The British forces secured victory that day. Siraj-ud-Dowlah was captured and promptly executed. Mir Jafar was installed as the new governor, a puppet ruler under British influence. While a few short months later, in September, a naval and land battle would occur at Negapatam within the Maratha territory. As the French made their way to Negapatam under the leadership of Kamti Dalali, the allied English and Maratha forces were ready for action. The battle commenced with naval clashes off the coast of Negapatam, as the British and French fleets locked horns in a fierce contest of cannon fire and naval maneuvering. On land, the British and Marathas advanced against the well-fortified French positions, determined to wrest control of the strategic stronghold. The combined might of the British and Marathas, bolstered by their meticulous planning and coordinated attacks, proved overwhelming. The superior British naval power, military prowess, and the Marathas' formidable presence bore fruit. The French were decimated and left with a weakened army in the Indian theater. While in America, though, the French were ready to defend. However, they did not expect the British under General Geoffrey Amherst to attack Louisbourg on the eastern shores of Canada. The naval bombardment began, cannonballs tearing through the air with thunderous roars as British ships unleashed their fury on the fortress. Day after day, the relentless barrage continued, breaching walls and weakening the defenders within. On June 23, 1758, the assault reached its climax. British troops stormed the breached walls, muskets firing, bayonets fixed. The defenders fought bravely, but the relentless British advance proved unstoppable. Street by street, bastion by bastion, the fortress was wrested from French hands. 2 weeks later, on July 8th, British General James Abercrombie devised an audacious plan to capture the fortress of Carillon in modern-day New York. With their large amount of troops and military planning, they felt they were ready to take over. However, French commander Louis-Joseph de Montcalm had fortified Carillon well. The fortress stood amidst a labyrinth of dense woods and rugged terrain. It was not just a fortress, it was a natural stronghold. The battle began with a determined British assault. Cannons roared, muskets cracked, and the clash of steel filled the air. The British and American colonial troops pressed forward, but the French defenses were formidable. General Montcalm's troops, fighting with resolve, held their ground. The British and colonial forces could not breach the French defenses despite repeated attempts. The fortress of Carillon remained impregnable. As casualties mounted, Major General Abercrombie made a difficult decision to order a retreat. Next year, in 1759, the British were back at Fort Carillon, determined to take it over. This time under General Amherst, and through meticulous planning and luck, the English could take over the fort easily and renamed it Fort Ticonderoga. This created a new target for the British, Quebec. At first, Major General James Wolfe and Admiral Charles Saunders tried to besiege the city of Quebec. However, they were unprepared and retreated. Within Quebec, Montcalm's French defenders prepared for the inevitable showdown. The fateful day came on September 13, 1759. Wolfe hatched a daring plan. Under the cover of night, British troops scaled these seemingly insurmountable cliffs and descended upon the Plains of Abraham like ghosts. The Battle of the Plains of Abraham began in the dim light of dawn, in a brief but furious clash. The fate of Quebec hung in the balance. Both leaders, Wolfe and Montcalm, fell wounded in the heat of the battle. Wolfe, mortally injured, gazed upon the victory he had secured with his last breath. As the dust settled, news reached Wolfe that the British had emerged triumphant. The Plains of Abraham were theirs, but it came at a heavy cost. Wolfe had given his life for victory. With their city surrounded and supplies dwindling, the French forces had no choice but to surrender. On September 18, 1759, Quebec, the bastion of New France, fell into British hands. India, while all the way across the world in Madras, the French, under General Thomas Lally Tollendal's leadership, sought to eliminate England from the continent. The French forces, bolstered by Indian allies from the Mysore kingdom, descended upon the city with a fervor matched only by the sweltering heat. Cannons roared, muskets crackled, and the battlefield was enveloped in a tumultuous cloud of smoke and dust. The fate of Madras hung in the balance. Under the command of Colonel Eyre Coote, the British defenders put up a tenacious resistance. Wave after wave of French assaults crashed against their determined ranks. The battle raged on for hours, and the outcome remained uncertain. As the sun began its descent, a momentous turning point occurred. A British counterattack, led by Colonel Coote, struck at the heart of the French lines. The British soldiers' resolve, their disciplined musket fire volleys, and the cannon's thunder broke the French advance. The French forces, battered and weary, were forced to withdraw. As the year turned, the battleground shifted to Wandiwash, a region in southern India. Now a seasoned commander, General Eyre Coote faced off against the French under Comte de Lally Tollendal yet again. Despite their determination, the French were weakened by attrition, disease, and dwindling resources from the prolonged siege of Wandiwash. General Coote, seizing the moment, orchestrated a well-coordinated assault. The British forces pressed forward with unwavering resolve. As the day drew to a close, the outcome became clear. The French defenses crumbled before the relentless British advance. Comte de Lally Tollendal was captured. The only remaining French city in North America was the stronghold of Montreal, which was the target of attack a year later. British General Geoffrey Amherst planned a multi-pronged campaign to encircle Montreal. Columns of British troops moved precisely, one advancing along the St. Lawrence River, another ascending Lake Champlain, and a third pushing northward from Lake Ontario. However, the French were easily outnumbered. The noose tightened around Montreal as days turned into weeks. Weary and without hope of relief, the French garrison finally capitulated on September 8, 1760, marking the end of French colonial rule in Canada. While a similar fate was in store for the French in the Indian subcontinent. As in the heart of the Coromandel coast, the British forces laid siege to the mighty city of Pondicherry. The city was fortified, its defenses formidable, but as months and the siege continued relentlessly, British cannons bombarded the city over and over again until January 15, 1761, when Pondicherry was capitulated. Later, the army would continue capturing the nearby French enclaves of Karaikal and Yanam. The British army would continue through the Malabar coast, near the Arabian Sea, capturing the French town of Mahe. While in the Mysore region, British forces in the Kingdom of Hyderabad clashed with the French and Mysorean troops near Seringapatam. The outcome was clear. The British and their allies emerged triumphant, eliminating French power in the subcontinent. However, the British were not done. In the Caribbean, the British were able to capture the islands of Guadeloupe, Dominica, Martinique, St. Lucia, and Grenada from the French, and Havana from the Spanish. It was clear to the world that the English were the ones to be in control. From the Caribbean to North America to India, the world was British, flying under the Union Jack. Due to their military success, the British was quite triumphant when it came to peace talks in Paris. France agreed to cede Canada to the British Empire, as long as the rights of French Roman Catholics in Canada were protected. The Spanish, still wanting to control Havana, made a trade England couldn't refuse. Havana would return to Spanish control in exchange for the swamplands of Florida in the American South. For India, the treaty reaffirmed British control of Bengal, Madras, and Bombay. The British were on top of the world. The English, reeling in debt and collectively weak, wanted to maintain peace in North America with the natives. So they passed the Proclamation of 1763, which created a boundary line across the Appalachian Mountains from Nova Scotia to Florida. Westward expansion by American colonists beyond this line was strictly prohibited. The British hoped to avoid costly conflicts with Native American tribes by creating a buffer zone. However, the Ohio Company under George Washington blatantly ignored such regulations because they were already there. Nevertheless, the English Parliament was right because the war chief of the Odawa tribe, Pontiac and his allies were gearing up to attack. In May 1763, the Native Americans laid siege to Fort Detroit, which would be followed by the sieging of Fort Michilimackinac and Fort Sandusky. The British were stunned by the coordination and ferocity of these attacks. As the conflict escalated, the British under Colonel Henry Bouquet devised a plan to break the siege at Fort Pitt, formerly Fort Duquesne. The Battle of Bushy Run in 1763 was fierce, but it showcased British resilience and signaled that they could effectively counter Native American assaults. Pontiac, however, was not just a warrior, he was a diplomat as well. He crisscrossed the wilderness, forging alliances and building a loose coalition among the tribes. His leadership was instrumental in keeping the rebellion alive. By 1764, the rebellion began to lose momentum. Many tribal leaders recognized that continued fighting might not achieve their desired outcomes. Negotiations commenced, and eventually, there was peace. After over 100 years of dealing with the British East India Company, the Mughal Empire was in a state of decline and near collapse, while the English were able to get rights to India through the Treaty of Paris. Hence, in 1765, England signed the Treaty of Allahabad with the Mughal Empire, which changed British relations in the subcontinent. This treaty granted the English East India Company Diwani rights, or the right to collect taxes. This means the company was given the right to collect revenue, land revenue administration, on behalf of the Mughal Emperor Shah Alam II in the provinces of Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa. Essentially, the company gained control over these territories' economic and financial administration. In return for the Diwani rights, the British East India Company agreed to pay an annual tribute of 2.6 million rupees to the Mughal Emperor. This was seen as a symbolic gesture to maintain the appearance of Mughal sovereignty. In principle, though, they were now colonies of the British. Even with the Treaty of Allahabad, the British were in financial debt after the 7 Years' War. So, in America, they passed the Stamp Act of 1765, which required American colonists to place an embossed revenue stamp on virtually all printed documents. The way to receive this stamp is by paying money directly to the British government as direct tax. The purpose of this act was for the British military to pay their troops after the 7-Year War. However, the colonists detested this new policy, so they came up with the slogan, "No taxation without representation," since they were not included in the English Parliament. Due to this immediate backlash from the tax, it was repealed and replaced by the Declaratory Act, which says Parliament hath, and of right ought to have, full power and authority to make laws and statutes of sufficient force and validity to bind the colonies and people of America in all cases whatsoever. The British felt they had the right to do whatever they wanted with their colonies. The question remained, what would the American colonies do about it? While the Americans were upset about taxation, the English were not done expanding. When James Cook in 1768 embarked on the HMS Endeavour, he was sent on a mission to explore the mysterious and vast South Pacific. With sails billowing in the wind, Cook and his crew departed from Plymouth, England in August. Their destination was the farthest reaches of the known world, where the boundaries of science and discovery blurred into the infinite blue horizon. After years of arduous sea travel, they made it to the southern hemisphere, where in April 1770, they discovered an unexpected landmass. Before this part, explorers thought they had the entire world figured out. But yet, James Cook just stumbled upon the continent of Australia. Cook and his crew made their first landfall at a place now known as Botany Bay, in what would become New South Wales, Australia. Stepping ashore, they encountered a landscape unlike any they had seen before. Exotic flora and fauna greeted them, as did the indigenous people who had called this land home for millennia. Cook's mission was not just to claim the land for Britain, but also to record the area. Cook and his crew spent months meticulously charting the eastern coastline of this vast continent. They sailed northward, their maps growing more detailed with each passing day. Cook was a skilled navigator whose precise measurements in cartography were unrivaled. As they ventured farther north, they encountered a range of environments, from dense rainforests to pristine beaches and coral reefs, to kangaroos and koalas, to venomous snakes and crocodiles. The world's newest and most dangerous frontier was discovered. With the east coast of Australia thoroughly mapped and explored, Cook formally claimed possession of the eastern shore for Great Britain, naming it New South Wales with hopes of one day making it a formal colony. His declaration would set in motion a new chapter in the history of this land, the empire that spans the world. This newfound discovery has made the British Empire a pinnacle for the world. As an Irishman and the governor of Grenada, George Macartney would write, "This vast empire on which the sun never sets, and whose bounds nature has not yet ascertained. From the French-speaking colony of Quebec, to the Quaker city of Philadelphia, to the slave plantations of Georgia, to the islands of Grenada and Jamaica, to the neighbor of Ireland, to the homeland of England, to Cape Coast in Africa, to the province of Bengal, to the newly discovered land of New South Wales. Wherever you go, the sun will always shine on the British Empire." But sometimes the sun can shine too bright, because a revolution was on the horizon in the 13 colonies of America. On July 4th, 1776, a famous letter was signed in Independence Hall in Philadelphia titled "The Declaration of Independence," with the words that echo throughout America today. "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." However, this document wasn't just a battle cry for the American colonists. Rather, it was a scathing letter directed towards King George III, with 27 reasons why they were revolting. As the American founding fathers would put it, the colonies of the Americas were founded on the principles of freedom. The original colonists moved to America because they objected to the current religious or economic situation within the British mainland. They were the ones who rejected their rules. They were the ones who wanted to create their own way. And so, when John Hancock signed his name in giant letters, followed by 55 of his compatriots, a war for freedom was on. General George Washington and his men were in Long Island, New York, desperate to defend the American home front. His Continental Army, composed mainly of civilians turned soldiers, now bore the weight of America's newfound freedom. They held a fervent belief in liberty, but lacked the seasoned experience of their adversaries. Across the water, British General William Howe prepared for a swift victory. A professional soldier with a record of battlefield successes, Howe was determined to put this colonial rebellion to rest. With his disciplined British soldiers, hired Hessian mercenaries, and loyalists supporting him, the stage was set for a grand military display. As dawn broke on August 27, 1776, the serene landscapes of Brooklyn were ruptured by the sounds of warfare. Utilizing their superior training, the British soldiers executed an ingenious flanking maneuver. The American defenders were taken by surprise and forced to retreat, allowing the British to retake New York. However, by December, George Washington wasn't ready to give up. His new target was the Hessian camp in Trenton, New Jersey. With 2,400 men in tow, Washington began the dangerous crossing. Navigating treacherous ice floes and fighting exhaustion, they reached New Jersey's shores. With the darkness as their cloak, they marched towards Trenton, muskets at the ready, spurred on by the promise of dawn and the element of surprise. As the first light of December 26th broke, the Continental Army descended on the sleepy town of Trenton. The Hessians, caught entirely off guard, scrambled to their positions. Their muskets, dampened by the cold, failed to fire, while the booming voices of American sergeants echoed orders in the early morning air. The Hessians, overwhelmed and outmaneuvered, surrendered to the resurgent Americans. However, the British were not done. By September 1777, General John Burgoyne hatched a plan to sever New England from the rest of the colonies. But the Americans, under the leadership of General Horatio Gates and Benedict Arnold, stood in defiance. Saratoga became the stage where the fate of two worlds would be decided. At Freeman's Farm, the first encounter saw the Americans pushed back. But it wasn't a clear victory for Burgoyne. His forces were heavily bruised. A few weeks later, at Bemis Heights, the British would taste the full wrath of the American spirit. Against the odds, the Continentals held firm, repelling the British assault. By October 17th, a shocked and humiliated Burgoyne surrendered his entire army. The Americans won. News traveled to the corners of the world, including the Versailles Place in Paris. King Louis XVI, who was bitter at the French humiliation during the 7 Years' War, saw his chance to defeat and weaken the British. The victory of Saratoga was undeniable proof that America could win this war, which allowed diplomat Benjamin Franklin to convince King Louis XVI to join the war against their mutual enemy. Their Franco-American alliance was the united front of the Americans in the Siege of Yorktown in 1781. The esteemed British general Lord Charles Cornwallis had led his troops into Yorktown. The peninsula, he believed, was a stronghold. Its access to the York River meant the British Navy could quickly reinforce or evacuate them. But as he set about fortifying his position, little did he know that the web of fate was unweaving against him. They knew what to do once General George Washington and French General Jean-Baptiste Rochambeau heard of Cornwallis's location: to lay siege to Yorktown. As September wore on, Cornwallis began to sense the encroaching danger. Washington and Rochambeau's forces had begun their relentless march, and soon the outskirts of Yorktown echoed with the march of thousands of boots. But the true shock for Cornwallis came from the water. The French had bested the mighty British fleet, his lifeline. The York River and the Chesapeake Bay were no longer his escape routes. They were traps. The siege began with an intensity that shook the very foundations of Yorktown. Day after day, the American and French cannons fired, weakening the British defenses. The morale of Cornwallis's men plummeted as provisions ran low and hope grew dimmer. By mid-October, the situation for Cornwallis grew desperate. His defenses crumbled, his men were demoralized, and escape routes were sealed. On the morning of October 17th, a white flag rose over Yorktown. Cornwallis sought a ceasefire and surrendered. 2 years later, the Treaty of Paris, 1783, was signed in Paris, and America was officially independent, creating a physical border between the free Americans and the British colonies of Quebec. The once enemies are now neighbors. The English might have lost America, but their power in India was only growing. With many Indian provinces, including Bengal, going through a famine, the need for financial wealth grew. So, in 1784, English Prime Minister William Pitt could redefine the Anglo-Indian relationship again by passing the East India Company Act of 1784. The English East India Company was still able to retain financial control over Bengal, Madras, and Bombay. However, critical political decisions would be left for a secret 6-person council selected by the king to rule over the Indian colonies without any form of representation from the Indian people. This committee was aptly named the Board of Control. Learning from their failures in America, they kept it top secret with minimal oversight and records. The Board of Control was able to do anything they pleased in a continent they barely knew. With the Americas officially not a British colony anymore, the British needed to find a new place to send their prisoners. The choice was obvious. The unhospitable desert land of Australia was discovered just a mere 2 decades ago. Captain Arthur Phillip guided 1,400 people, half of whom were convicts, to the newly discovered New South Wales. So on May 13, 1787, Captain Arthur Phillip, guiding 700 convicts and 700 free settlers, left Portsmouth, England, and took a journey of over 24,000 kilometers and 8 months to Botany Bay, New South Wales. Once they landed, Arthur Phillip quickly realized that Botany Bay would be a horrible place to set up a settlement. The bay was open and unprotected. The water was too shallow to allow the ships to anchor close to the shore. Fresh water was scarce, and the soil was poor. First contact was made with the local Eora people, who seemed suspicious of the newcomers. The area was studded with enormously strong trees. When the convicts tried to cut them down, their tools broke, and the tree trunks had to be blasted out of the ground with gunpowder. Philip decided to explore further. He discovered a more promising spot just a few kilometers north, Port Jackson at Sydney Cove. With its deep waters, sheltered coves, and more favorable conditions for a budding settlement, Philip would write it is the finest harbor in the world, in which 1,000 sail of the line may ride in the most perfect security. On January 26, 1788, the fleet weighed anchor and sailed to Port Jackson. The site selected for the anchorage had deep water close to the shore, was sheltered, and had a small stream flowing into it. Philip named it Sydney Cove, after Lord Sydney, the British Home Secretary. This date is celebrated as Australia Day. However, this too was not enough to stop the incoming famine. These Europeans were not used to Australia's harsh, unpredictable climate, nor knew how to feed themselves. The colony struggled to survive, but that did not stop the English from sending more and more prison hulks to the shores of Australia. As the colony could not support themselves, they continued to grow and struggle. The English may have lost America, but their stranglehold over the continent was not done. As the Americans were creating the Constitution and testing out this idea of democracy, many of the British loyalists and former slaves who disagreed with American ideals fled to British colonies of Canada. However, Quebec was still home to many French people who had their own culture and wanted to ensure it was protected. Nevertheless, as more and more British loyalists were about to move in, the French Canadians were ready to fight. However, instead of starting a new law, the British Parliament created the Constitution Act of 1791, which divided Canada into two colonies, Upper and Lower Canada. Upper Canada, in modern-day southern Ontario, was quickly anglicized. They would adopt British common law Anglicanism and were home to many escaping loyalists. Lower Canada, on the other hand, maintained French civil law, French Catholicism, and the French language. Even though they may be under the rule of the English, they were able to keep their culture entirely separate. The act also allowed Upper and Lower Canada to have a legislative assembly for both colonies. However, they still did not have any parliamentary representatives. For the former slaves, who fought for Britain in exchange for freedom in the American Revolution, found life in Canada to be quite hard. They may have been freed, they were not equal. They were still discriminated against and were quite poor. They had expected a better life, better prospects, and true freedom. That's why, in the crisp winter of 1791, abolitionist and British naval officer John Clarkson proposed a new African town called Freetown, a place where the slaves would not have to deal with the cold, harsh Canadian winters and even harsher discrimination. So, on February 26, 1792, more than 1,100 former slaves got on a ship that sailed out of Nova Scotia back to their ancestral homeland. On March 9th, they landed on the coast, where they created the small town of Freetown as part of the Sierra Leone Company. While Sierra Leone was being founded, the Dutch rule of the Cape Colony was ending. The Cape, a seemingly remote outpost at the southern tip of Africa, was more than just a refreshment station for weary sailors. It was the gateway to the East, a strategic jewel that every European power coveted. For the Dutch, it was home, where they had laid roots, mingled with indigenous cultures, and built a life for over a century. But as the winds from the north grew more robust, they brought British ships on the horizon. Admiral Elphinstone, leading the British fleet, knew the stakes. Control the Cape, and you control the seas to the East Indies. So the British troops moved in and took over the colony from the Dutch. Back in Isles, Ireland was tired of being under the thumb of British rule yet again. The decimation of their ancient language of Gaelic and their religious beliefs of Catholicism were being stripped. In other colonies, the British were becoming more tolerant. However, they refused such acceptance in Ireland. So, in May 1798, the flame of rebellion was lit. From the lush fields of Wexford to the rocky shores of Antrim, Ireland rose. A young farmer named Sean O'Brien led a band of rebels fighting pitched battles against well-trained British forces. They faced victories and defeats, moments of camaraderie, and heart-wrenching losses. In one poignant moment, atop Vinegar Hill after a fierce battle, Sean looked over the land, his land. Despite the British victory that day, he saw not the end, but the beginning of a long struggle for freedom. The rebellion reached its climax when French forces, allies in the Irish cause, landed on the shores of County Mayo. It felt as if liberation was within reach, but the seasoned British forces proved too formidable. The French, along with their Irish allies, suffered defeat. Another failed Irish rebellion. While in the Sultanate of Mysore in India, the British were gaining influence and power. Tipu Sultan, the leader of the Mysore people, contacted the French, asking to be allies to destroy the English, like how they did in America. But yet France did not help this time, forcing the Mysorean people to defend for themselves. The news of Tipu's secret correspondence with the distant French engulfed the world in flames due to the British vast spy network. The Governor-General, Richard Wellesley, saw the potential danger of a Franco-Mysorean front. Determined to nip this threat in the bud, the British sought allies in the Nizam of Hyderabad and the formidable Marathas. As the British and their allies began their march, closing in on fortresses and territories, the atmosphere in Mysore grew tense. The roads leading to Seringapatam, Mysore's proud capital, echoed with the march of British boots and the rumbles of their cannons. Tipu, clad in his royal attire, frequently consulted with his generals. The map of his empire spread out before him, marked with strategies and plans. The weight of a kingdom's hope rested on his shoulders. The climax approached as the British forces, led by General Harris and a young yet notable officer, Arthur Wellesley, surrounded Seringapatam. With its stone walls and swirling river, the mighty fortress city had stood tall for years. Now, it was the last bastion of resistance against the British advance. For days, cannons, gunfire, and battle cries filled the air. The people of Mysore prayed for their sultan, their tiger. But on May 4th, 1799, tragedy struck. As British forces stormed the fortress, Tipu Sultan, fighting fiercely in defense of his beloved city, fell. With his death, the resistance crumbled. Mysore was divided, with large swaths of its territory taken by the victors. The Wodeyar dynasty, once rulers of the region before Tipu's rise, were restored to the throne, but only as puppet monarchs to the British. With the failure of the Irish Rebellion, the English wanted to find a way to ensure the Irish would never revolt again. So the United Kingdom Parliament, which already involved Wales, England, and Scotland, would include Ireland for the first time on the eve of January 1st, 1801. The Irish Parliament was dissolved and merged with the rest of Great Britain. Wales, England, Scotland, Ireland. 4 kingdoms, 1 union, 1 Great Britain. Major General Richard Wellesley wasn't done expanding the English influence in India. On September 23, 1803, Wellesley and his 7,000 troops crossed the Kaituna River and faced the fragmented Maratha Confederacy, with an army of over 40,000 soldiers and an untold amount of battle elephants. The British aimed to flank the Marathas, but soon realized they were up against the entire Maratha force, leading to direct engagement. The Marathas were known for their cavalry and guerrilla warfare tactics. The swift charges of the Maratha cavalry posed a severe challenge to the British infantry squares. Meanwhile, the Maratha artillery relentlessly pounded the advancing British troops. However, the British had 2 advantages: superior training and discipline of their troops, and a more coordinated use of artillery. As the battle intensified, the British artillery began to find its mark, wreaking havoc on the Maratha formations. As the days went on, both sides had considerable losses, but the Marathas had to withdraw and sign the Treaty of Deogham. This saw Maratha chieftain Raghojee II give the territories situated north of the Warda, Gowilgar, and Narnala to the British, along with the district of Cuttack. However, back in Europe, the British would be put on the defensive by Napoleon Bonaparte, the ambitious French emperor who had his eyes on conquering Europe. Napoleon needed control over the waves to secure his dominion over Europe, which meant breaking the British naval blockade. The French and their allied Spanish fleet had been harbored in Cadiz. Together, they would clear the English Channel, allowing Napoleon's armies to invade Britain. However, Admiral Lord Horatio Nelson was aware of their planned attacks. So, as the sun climbed the horizon, Nelson, aboard the HMS Victory, made a daring choice. Eschewing traditional naval tactics, he ordered his fleet to split into two columns and charge directly at the Franco-Spanish line. It was a bold move, one that risked everything. The thunder of cannons broke the morning silence. Amidst the din and smoke, the two navies clashed. The British ships, notably the Victory and the Temeraire, bore down upon the enemy, with Nelson's tactic aiming to slice through their line, creating chaos. As the hours wore on, the superior training and tactics of the British began to tell. One by one, Franco-Spanish ships were either captured or rendered combat ineffective. By sunset, the British had established their dominance of Europe. When you can't win by fighting, you tend to take the battle to the realm of trade. In 1806, Napoleon passed the Berlin Decree, which declared that the British Isles were to be in a constant state of blockade and barred all trade with Great Britain. In response, Great Britain passed the Orders in Council. Any English-controlled colony was barred from trade with France. Also, if you complied with the Berlin Decree or tried to evade the British military, your ship would be seized. As well, any ports that followed the Napoleonic Decree were blockaded and not allowed to have vessels enter and leave. The Battle of the Blockades was on. As the English and French fought about trade, Great Britain changed the game once again. In 1807, the British Parliament passed the Abolition of the Slave Trade Act, which made it illegal to engage in the slave trade within the British colonies. However, slavery was still legal. You could still own a slave, you couldn't trade them internationally. Most English fighting during the Napoleonic Wars occurred on the Spanish Peninsula in the water, such as the Battle of Orleans, the Battle of Vimero, and the Battle of Corunna. Napoleon, who was spreading out his resources across the continent, didn't have enough to fight the British. He just allowed his navy to get decimated by the British. While the British were more successful in battle, they still needed more recruits for the Royal Navy. Under the Order in Council, the British seized 400 American merchant ships and their cargoes between 1807 and 1812 and drafted them to the Royal Navy. Also, France and England creating sanctions for one another made it impossible for Americans to receive any trade from the rest of Europe. So on June 18, 1812, the young nation of America declared war against its former colonizer. They wanted their merchant ships to be free and to have fair trade across Europe. So, American General William Hull went into the inlands of Upper Canada, trying to capture it. However, he was unsuccessful and retreated back to Fort Detroit. This led British Major General Isaac Brock and their Shawnee allies under Tecumseh to target Detroit. Tecumseh had his warriors parade in and out of the woods multiple times, creating the illusion of a much larger force. This, along with the intimidating war cries and other deceptive tactics, made Hull believe he was vastly outnumbered. Meanwhile, Brock sent a demand for surrender, hinting that if a battle began, he might be unable to control the native warriors from attacking American civilians and soldiers alike. This psychological ploy preyed on Hull's fears. Without a shot being fired from the British cannons, and with minimal direct engagement, Hull surrendered Fort Detroit to the British on August 16, 1812. The war wouldn't get any easier for the Americans because on January 18, 1813, a small American army wanted to reclaim Detroit. Initially, they did. But on January 22nd, British Colonel Henry Proctor, leading a combined force of British, Canadians, and Native Americans, unleashed a fury of gunfire, shouts, and war cries, shattering the winter silence. The Americans were caught off guard, especially on their left flank, which quickly crumbled under the pressure. On January 23rd, the Americans surrendered. However, their surrender wasn't accepted, and they were killed on the spot by Native American soldiers. The Americans, enraged, attacked the capital city of York, modern-day Toronto, on April 27th. The American force was quickly able to outnumber and defeat the British. Upon capturing York, the discipline of the American troops broke down. Despite the orders of their officers, they looted and set fire to several buildings, including the Parliament of Upper Canada. A year later, the British and Canadian armies would get their revenge when the British and American forces clashed at the Battle of Bladensburg, Maryland. Despite the Americans having a numerical advantage and a defensive position, they were swiftly defeated and the British marched into Washington, D.C. Entering the capital, the British were initially cautious, expecting some trap or a significant American defense, but they found Washington largely abandoned. Important buildings, including the White House, the Capitol, and other government buildings, were set alight. The fires could be seen miles away. The destruction was systematic and targeted primarily at public and governmental structures. The British occupation of Washington was brief, and they left just a day later. As Napoleon was falling apart in Europe due to their constant losses against Russia and the rest of Europe, he signed the Treaty of Paris 1814, which restored the French monarchy to King Louis XVIII. England thought about sending more forces to the American theater. However, they knew that the Americans were too rebellious to follow their will again. So the day before Christmas, on December 24, 1814, the Treaty of Ghent was signed, which stated that all territories captured in the war would be returned to their pre-war owners, which means no borders were to be changed. It was also reaffirmed that America was its own nation, and Canada would always be separate from that. Instead, they focused on the Himalayas and the Kingdom of Nepal, governed by the Gurkha soldiers. The Gurkhas, renowned for their courage and military prowess, had expanded their territories. But to their south, another giant was growing, the British East India Company, which had begun to see Nepal as a strategic buffer against potential Chinese incursions. The initial spark for conflict was the shared interest in the Terai region, a fertile belt between the Himalayas and the plains of India. Border disputes and territorial ambitions from both sides culminated in the British East India Company declaring war on Nepal in 1814. The battle began at Nalapani near Dehradun. The fortress there, defended by the brilliant Gurkha commander Amar Singh Thapa, resisted British advances for over a month, giving the Gurkhas their first taste of the formidable might they were up against. However, the British, unaccustomed to mountain warfare and underestimating the Gurkhas, found themselves repelled repeatedly. The Gurkhas employed guerrilla tactics in various encounters, leveraging their knowledge of the local terrains. However, the British had superior numbers, advanced weaponry, and strategic depth. Over the months, critical areas like the Kathmandu Valley were threatened, and the Gurkhas felt the strain of the war despite their bravery and dedication. By early 1815, it was evident that the Gurkhas, though fierce and admirable in their resistance, couldn't stem the tide. Peace talks commenced, leading to the Treaty of Shugali in 1815. Nepal was forced to cede a significant portion of its western and eastern territories to the British, redrawing the borders of the two powers. As the Maratha Confederacy was struggling to survive, the British saw the chance to knock the final blow to this empire. The Maratha Peshwa, which translates roughly into foremost leader, Baji Rao II, knew that his power was relatively minimal after the Treaty of Deogaon, and he was just a pawn. The Maratha chiefs, the Holkars of Indore, the Bonsals of Nagpur, the Scindias of Gwalior, and the Gaekwads of Baroda, had their own ambitions and differences. Internal squabbles often overshadowed their collective power. On the other hand, the British, under Governor-General Lord Hastings, saw an opportunity amidst this discord. Baji Rao II, hoping to restore some of the lost Maratha prestige, began secretly building up his military might, and tales of his preparations soon reached British ears. Their intelligence was impeccable, seeing the Peshwa's actions as a treaty violation, which had assured the British of his non-aggression. Lord Hastings believed in striking first. The Battle of Khadki near Pune saw British forces led by General Smith clash fiercely with the Marathas. After intense fighting, the British emerged victorious, capturing Pune and neutralizing Peshwa's power. But the war was far from over. To the northeast, in Nagpur, Raghoji II Bonsal led his forces against the British. The Battle of Sitabuldi was brutal, with both sides taking heavy casualties. The Marathas fought valiantly, but the disciplined and well-equipped British troops, under the command of Colonel Scott, prevailed. Simultaneously, the Holkars were gearing up to face the British in central India. The confrontation resulted in several skirmishes, with neither side gaining a decisive advantage. However, the sheer persistence of the British forces gradually wore down the Maratha resistance. Then there were the Scindias of Gwalior. Understanding the overwhelming odds against him, Daulat Rao Scindia decided to remain neutral. This was a significant blow to the Maratha and caused the eventual surrender. As they signed the Treaty of Mandaswara in 1818, the Maratha Confederacy was dismantled and its territories were annexed by the British. The Peshwa title was abolished, and Baji Rao II was exiled to Bithur, ending a once great confederacy. As the English were expanding, they needed another fort to help navigate the waters of Asia. So Sir Thomas Stramford Raffles was tasked with finding a new place to create a trading fort. Eventually, Raffles settled on the island of Singapore because of its position at the southern tip of the Malay Peninsula, near the Straits of Malacca, and its excellent natural harbor, freshwater supplies, and timber for repairing ships. Raffles' expedition arrived in Singapore on January 29, 1819, putting this strategic island under British control. While in India, the British weren't done expanding. They saw the Konbaing dynasty of Burma as a threat to British expansion. It began with the Burmese occupation of the island of Shalpuri in 1824. For the British, this was a sign of looming Burmese encroachments of Bengal. Responding, the British struck decisively with a two-pronged invasion, quickly capturing the port of Rangoon. They had expected the fall of this significant city to bring the Burmese to the negotiating table, but the Konbaing dynasty was resilient. Rather than engaging in open battle, they adopted guerrilla warfare, relying on the monsoon rains and the dense forests to wear down the foreign invaders. For nearly 2 years, the jungles of Burma witnessed a strategic game of cat and mouse, with neither side willing to yield. Though superior in equipment and naval power, the British were tested by the unfamiliar terrain and the relentless Burmese resistance. Finally, in 1826, with both powers exhausted and drained, diplomats met to draft the Treaty of Yandabo. Burma recognized British claims over Assam, Manipur, Kachar, and Jaintia, while ceding Arakan and Tenasserim's coastal regions. A heavy silver indemnity would be paid to the British, further straining the Burmese treasury. While back in Parliament, Great Britain was going through culturally its own troubles. In 1829, they passed the Roman Catholic Relief Act of 1829, which allowed Catholics legally serving in Parliament for the first time. Within days, Irish Catholic Daniel O'Connell was able to take his seat in the House of Commons. The countless wars, resettlements, and prejudice against Anglicanism and Catholicism were starting to be resolved. Religious acceptance was growing in the Isles. However, acceptance of the Aboriginal people of Australia was not part of the plan. The island of Van Diemen's Land, now known as Tasmania, had been inhabited by the indigenous Palawa people for thousands of years. However, the British arrival and the ever-increasing number of settlers made it hard for the Palawa people to survive. This resulted in the Palawa, in their bid for survival, occasionally raiding settler farms for food. The settlers, feeling threatened, often retaliated with violence. As time went on, confrontations became more frequent. Reports of violent skirmishes, kidnappings, and killings became commonplace. The settlers termed these confrontations the Black War. As tensions escalated, the colonial administration under Lieutenant Governor George Arthur declared martial law, allowing settlers to kill Palawa on sight. In a large-scale attempt to resolve the issue, 1830 saw the formation of the Black Line. It was a human chain comprising settlers, convicts, and troops meant to traverse the island and drive the remaining Palawa into the Tasman Peninsula, where they would be isolated. This line was largely ineffective and costly. By 1831, under the guise of Christianity, all of the remaining Palawa were moved to Flinders Island, where most died due to disease, malnutrition, and despair. History is never black or white, because on August 28, 1833, the Slavery Abolition Act was passed. The act gradually emancipated all slaves throughout the British Empire within 6 years. Also, the act gave £20 million, approximately £2 billion today, to compensate slave owners for losing their property. The former slaves did not receive any of this money for themselves. Instead, they were forced to fend for themselves with no assets. In 1835 in Australia, a man named John Batman found a place unknown to his fellow colonies that he aptly named Batmania. Under a questionable Batman's treaty with the local Aboriginal people, the Kulin Nation, Batman claimed to purchase 600,000 acres. The dubious agreement involved simple trinkets in exchange for vast lands. In 1836, the colony of South Australia was officially proclaimed, and with grand fanfare, Adelaide was born. Meanwhile, to the east in New South Wales, the relentless explorer Major Thomas Mitchell ventured further into the southeast, painting tales of fertile lands, coaxing more settlers to dream of new beginnings. 1837, the colony of Victoria, named after Queen Victoria, was officially recognized. The name of the city Batmania was changed to Melbourne. While in China, the British were facing an issue. They loved the taste of Chinese tea. All across the empire, people wanted to drink the luxurious tea. The only problem was that the British didn't have anything worth that the Chinese desired, except for Indian opium. The highly addictive drug ruined lives, and the Qing dynasty did not want it in their empire. So the Qing dynasty appointed Lin Jeju to eradicate all opium trading within China. His approach was unwavering: confiscate and destroy. The beaches of Guangzhou soon bore witness to an immense pyre, with tons of confiscated opium set ablaze, sending dark plumes of smoke skywards. The message was clear: China would no longer be a silent spectator. This act was not taken lightly by the British. The far-reaching British Empire saw it as a violation of trade rights. Their navy, bolstered by ironclad, steam-powered gunboats, was sent with an order to protect British interests. The waters of China, especially near its treasured ports, became a theater of naval skirmishes and confrontations. Soon, the British forces proved too formidable for the Qing dynasty. Using their superior naval power, they made strategic advancements along the coast. The Chinese defenses, steeped in traditional warfare, were ill-equipped against the firepower of the British gunboats. The two nations found themselves at a negotiating table in Nanking as the dust settled. The resulting Treaty of Nanking was heavily skewed in favor of the British. A bitter pill for the Chinese, the treaty saw them ceding the island of Hong Kong, paying a hefty indemnity, and opening up their ports to the British so that they could legally sell their opium. Off the coast of Australia lies the attractive island of New Zealand. Many British settlers moved from Australia to the neighboring island to establish their homes. However, the islands were not empty. They were inhabited by the Maori people, an Aboriginal tribe that has been there for thousands of years. Lieutenant Governor William Hobson had the task of securing British sovereignty over New Zealand. So he wrote the Treaty of Waitangi in a matter of days in English, and then, shortly after, it was translated into Maori. On February 6th, when 500 Maori citizens debated the treaty, they thought they discussed the same document. However, the translation was inaccurate, which caused future tension. In the English version, Maori cede the sovereignty of New Zealand to Britain. Maori give the Crown an exclusive right to buy lands they wish to sell, and in return are guaranteed full rights of ownership of their lands, forests, fisheries, and other possessions. Maori are given the rights and privileges of British subjects. However, in the Maori version, the word sovereignty was translated as Kawanatonga, which means governance. The Maori people thought they were giving up their right to government. They did not realize they were giving supreme power to the crown to do whatever they pleased. Another translation error was that the English version guaranteed undisturbed possession of all their properties. At the same time, the Maori version says, Tino Rangatira Tanga Teonga, which translates into full authority over treasures that may be intangible. This slight difference meant the British believed they had exclusive rights to purchase land from the Maori and sell it to settlers. However, the Maori thought they would have full authority over their land and treasures and were not required to do such things. 40 Maori chiefs, including Hone Hoke, signed the treaty, and the English enforced their version of the treaty. As time passed, the English bought the land without the Maori understanding. Since the English bought it based on the European system, and the Maori didn't have the idea of land ownership in their society, that's when Hone Hoke realized signing was a mistake. The Maori were no longer independent. So, in a bold act of defiance, Heki, with the help of his allies, felled the Union Jack on Mikey Hill, not once, but 4 times. The Cowitti settlement of Kororika, modern-day Russell, soon became the battleground. In March 1845, Hone Heki and the formidable chief Teruki Cowitti devised a plan. As Heki engaged the British forces and their Maori allies, drawing their gaze and might, they were prepared to strike the British directly. The battle that ensued saw the streets of Kororika turn from bustling lanes of trade to avenues of conflict. The echoes of musket fire reverberated, mixing with the thunderous roars of cannons from the British naval ship HMS Hazard. When the ship's captain met his end at the hands of a Maori sniper, the tide began to turn. Kororika, under the weight of the onslaught, began to crumble. The British, realizing the town's precarious position, initiated a retreat, evacuating its residents. As they withdrew, flames consumed parts of the city, painting the sky a fiery orange. After a series of battles, the English started to send more troops because they knew the fighting with the Maori wasn't done. While in the Indian subcontinent, the Sikh Empire in Punjab was going through a succession crisis. After the death of Maharaja Ranjit Singh, the Sikh army, called the Khalsa, gained all the power and turned it into a military state. The Khalsa moved towards the Sutlej River, the border between the Sikh Empire and British India. The British, interpreting this as provocative, were quick to respond. The first military engagement at Mudka in December 1845 pitted the British troops led by Sir Hugo and Governor-General Sir Henry Hardinge against the Sikhs. With their artillery advantage, the British managed to secure a victory, but not without considerable losses. A few days later at Ferozshah, the British once again faced the Sikh forces. This confrontation was intense, spanning 2 days of fierce combat. The British faced a grim scenario on the first day with their troops exhausted and ammunition low. Yet with reinforcements and a resolute counterattack on the second day, they claimed another hard-fought victory. In the aftermath, the Treaty of Lahore was drafted. The Sikhs were made to cede the valuable region between the Beas and Sutlej rivers, pay reparations, and recognize a British resident in Lahore. However, the peace was short-lived, because under Sikhs leaders Maharaja Duleep Singh and Dewan Mulraj wanted their land back. After many battles were fought, the Battle of Gujarat was underway. The British forces unleashed a concentrated artillery bombardment against the Sikh positions. The relentless firepower, coupled with a coordinated infantry and cavalry assault, broke the Sikh lines, leading to a decisive British victory. This led to the Second Treaty of Lahore in March 1849. Maharaja Duleep Singh, the young ruler of the Sikh Empire, was formally deposed, and the empire was annexed into the British East India Company's territories. Punjab was officially under British control. The British weren't satisfied with their dominant control of India, they wanted it all. That's when the Governor-General of India, Lord James Dalhousie, created the doctrine of lapse policy. This policy declared that if any ruler of a dependent state died without a direct heir or the ruler was incompetent, the British would be given full control of the territory. He and his queen, Rani Lakshmibai, did not have surviving biological children. However, before his death, the Maharaja adopted a child named Damodar Rao. Rani Lakshmibai presented the young Damodar Rao to the British officers as the heir to the throne of Jhansi. However, Governor-General Lord Dalhousie, invoking the doctrine of lapse, refused to recognize the adopted child as the legitimate heir. Instead, they were annexed by the British and lost all autonomy. Regions and princely states such as Satara, Jaipur, Sambalpur, Nagpur, and Awadh were all annexed this way. At the time, the British East India Company army was mostly made of Indian soldiers called sepoy. These sepoys were paid less and treated poorly, and they had enough of being under British rule. So in March 1857, a sepoy named Mangal Pandey mutinied against his British officers at Barrackpore, for which he was subsequently hanged. However, the spark had been sowed, and on May 10, 1857, in Meerut, 85 sepoys rebelled. They broke rank, stormed the jail, and released their 85 imprisoned comrades. But their rage didn't stop there. The mutiny rapidly expanded, killing several British officers, Europeans, and Christian Indians in the cantonment. Buildings were set on fire, and Meerut was in chaos by nightfall. Many of the mutineers decided not to stay in Meerut, knowing they couldn't hold the garrison town. They began an overnight march to Delhi, which they reached the following day. Their sudden and unexpected arrival surprised the small British garrison in the city. The local infantry units stationed in Delhi and a large section of the city's civilian population joined the mutineers. They targeted British officers, civilians, and anyone associated with the East India Company's administration. The strategic Red Fort, the residence of the Mughal Emperor Bahadur Shah Zafar, was soon in their control. However, the British weren't ready to surrender. By early June, British forces, a mix of Europeans and loyal Indian regiments, assembled outside Delhi. General Archdale Wilson, a seasoned military man, looked at the formidable city walls respectfully and determinedly. Delhi had to be retaken. For the rebels within, the defense of Delhi was more than just a military strategy. The city was a symbol. It was about honor, a shared legacy, and a dream of freedom. Under their control, the streets resonated with both hope and zeal. But this hope was soon to be tested. As days progressed, British cannons from the Ridge, a strategic high ground north of Delhi, began their relentless bombardment. The city responded in kind, with its own guns roaring, painting the sky with trails of smoke. Then, in early September, the British had their break. General John Nicholson led troops to storm the Kashmir Gate, using explosives to breach this formidable entry point. As the dust settled, British forces began pouring in. Delhi's narrow alleys turned into mazes of combat. Rebel sniper shots from hidden rooftops, British bayonet charges, and street-to-street combat characterized the following days. Every corner of Chandni Chowk, every gate of the fort, became a testament to the bravery and the brutality of war. By September 20th, the British had a firm grip on Delhi. The Red Fort was once again under their control. Bahadur Shah Zafar II, the leader of the rebellion, was captured shortly after, marking a poignant end to the Sepoys' rebellion and the rule of the Mughal dynasty. In the aftermath, British retribution was swift and unforgiving. Many rebels met their end at the gallows, and parts of the city were left scarred and desolate. The Indian rebellion wasn't just isolated to Delhi, but covered the entire subcontinent. However, just like Delhi, the British quickly obliterated their opponents and forced them to surrender. As the gunshots ended, Britain passed the Government of India Act 1858, which ended the British East India Company and replaced it with the British Raj, which meant the Indian people were under the direct control of the monarch, Queen Victoria. There was no illusion of self-governance or financial companies. They were a colony of Britain. Under the Queen, a Council of India was created. The council, which consisted of 15 people who did not speak any of the native Indian languages, were given tyrannical controls of all political powers within the colony. British individuals were declared governors of different regions. English schools were set up so that the whites in India could still get educated and rule over the Indians. The English did everything they could to be politically, economically, and socially in control. In their minds, just by being British, they were superior and had the right to rule over all of India. Now, with the implementation of the Raj, their power has only grown. In New Zealand, the Maori faced a similar fate when in 1863, the British Empire passed the New Zealand Settlements Act, which allowed the government to confiscate land from the Maori tribes deemed to have rebelled against the crown. The Maori tried to unite and fend off the Brits. In battles throughout the Waikato War, both the Taranaki Wars and the Takuti's War, however, nothing could fend off the British. Across the world in Jamaica, with the abolition of slavery decades ago, the island was populated mainly by poor former slaves. Due to the right to vote being tied to landowners, during the election of 1864, fewer than 2,000 black men could vote out of a black population of 420,000, while 10,000 men were given the privilege. This happened while Jamaica was in a drought, dealing with cholera and smallpox. Tensions were high when, on October 11, 1865, a minor altercation outside a courthouse in Morant Bay escalated into a major confrontation. A black man was imprisoned for trespassing on a long-abandoned plantation. When a bystander protested the arrest, police tried to apprehend him, leading to skirmishes. Paul Bogle, a Baptist deacon and activist, led a march of hundreds from the village of Stony Gut to Morant Bay. The protest quickly turned violent, with the courthouse being burned down and several officials and militia members killed. Governor Edward John Eyre declared martial law in response to the rebellion. Over a few weeks, as many as 1,000 black Jamaicans were killed by British forces, and many more were flogged or punished. Paul Bogle and George William Gordon, a mixed-race legislator and critic of the governor, accused of conspiring in the rebellion, were hastily tried and executed. After the rebellion, the British government dissolved the Jamaican House of Assembly and replaced it with a British-appointed governor. This allowed Great Britain complete control of all Jamaican policies. While in Canada, the British restructured the 6 separate colonies of Upper Canada, Lower Canada, New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, Prince Edward Island, and British Columbia into a singular territory, the Dominion of Canada. However, the Ashanti peoples in the Gold Coast, modern-day Ghana, felt they could take land from the British. The Fanti region was between the Ashanti and the British, a buffer that kept the two empires at bay. The Ashanti saw the Fanti territories as part of their sphere, while the British viewed them under their protection. This tenuous balance was about to be disrupted. Under King Kofi Karikari, the Ashanti people lauded a campaign into the Fanti lands. They laid siege to the coastal fort of Elmina, and soon the British colonial capital, Cape Coast, felt the weight of Ashanti ambition pressing upon it. It wasn't long before Sir Garnet Wolseley, a battle-hardened British officer armed with modern rifles and cannons, landed on the Gold Coast. Soon they met at the village of Amoaful, which the Ashanti had turned into a fortress that seemed impenetrable. When Wolseley's men reached the village, the Ashanti warriors used the dense underbrush for stealthy guerrilla attacks. Their ambushes were deadly, their knowledge of the terrain unparalleled. But Wolseley had a plan. He dispatched his forces in multiple columns to surround and squeeze the Ashanti out of their defenses. As dusk approached, the village of Amoaful came under British control after witnessing fierce combat. The Ashanti warriors had to retreat. The following year, Kofi Karikari signed the Treaty of Fomena, which renounced the Ashanti claims to the Fanti territories and that Kofi would abdicate. The Ashanti became a British protectorate, though they retained some internal autonomy. The word of England might have spread like the plague, and some kings knew they should voluntarily surrender to the English for their people. Chief Kakabau, the king of the Fiji Islands, knew his islands were targets of the British. Facing internal pressures, mounting debts, and the looming threat of involuntary annexation, Cacabao saw a potential solution in ceding sovereignty voluntarily. He believed becoming a British protectorate could ensure internal stability and guard against other colonial powers. After negotiations, on October 10, 1874, Cacabao formally joined the British Empire. Some areas could just be bought with money. The Suez Canal was completed in a French-Egyptian joint project in 1869. The Suez Canal was revolutionary because the waterway offered direct maritime passage between the Mediterranean and the Red Sea, slashing the duration of the voyage to the British Raj in India. However, building such a canal put Ismail Pasha, the Khedive ruler of Egypt, in extraordinary debt. So British Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli raised £4 million to buy 44% of the canal shares. The value of this would be £378 million today. With the transaction finalized in 1875, the balance of power over the Suez Canal tilted decisively in Britain's favor. Sometimes other countries would be asked to join. In December of 1878, Sir Henry Bartle Frere sent an ultimatum to the Zulu king Cetshwayo. Frere felt that Zulus was getting too strong and needed to be stopped, so he told the Zulu to surrender or go to war. Cetshwayo chose to fight. So on January 22, 1879, on the plains of Isandlwana, the two forces first clashed with unforgettable fury. Using traditional tactics and shields, the disciplined Impi overran the British camp in an unprecedented victory, leaving over 1,300 British soldiers lifeless on the battlefield. However, spears and shields made out of cowhide can't beat muskets and helmets in the long run. On March 29th, the Zulu warriors faced a setback at Kambala, and by April 2nd at Jinjandlovu, it was evident that British technological superiority was beginning to tell. July 4th marked the final act of this drama. At the Royal Kraal of Ulundi, British and Zulu forces clashed for the last time. The British, under Lord Chelmsford, dealt a decisive blow, capturing the Zulu capital, allowing Britain even more control in South Africa. However, the British weren't done in South Africa because in December 1880, the Boers declared the gold-rich region of Transvaal independent, challenging the might of the British. A series of confrontations ensued. Using their intimate knowledge of the terrain, the Boers ambushed British troops at Brunghartsspruit, delivering a stinging blow. The British faced a monumental defeat atop Majuba Hill in February 1881. Losing their commander, Major General Sir George Pomeroy Colley. The intensity of Boers' resistance forced the British into reconciliation. By March 1881, the Treaty of Pretoria was signed, returning the Transvaal to the Boers, but under British suzerainty. Egypt, the once great country filled with pyramids and pharaohs, is now in debt to foreign bankers with little future prosperity. Ahmed Urabi, a young and charismatic officer in the Egyptian army, was ready for a change. Born into a peasant family, he had risen through the military ranks, not because of any privileged birthright, but due to sheer determination and skill. He saw the disparity daily, the Ottoman and Egyptian elite reveling in luxuries. At the same time, ordinary Egyptians toiled hard, sweat and blood feeding the elites and foreign bankers' dreams. Urabi met with fellow officers on a fateful day in a discreet tea house. Their passionate and heated conversations revolved around the pervasive European influence, the Suez Canal's control, and the need to restore dignity to the Egyptian people. That evening, casual musings evolved into an emotional vow to spark change. As word of his objectives spread, his cause quickly found resonance with the broader population. The grievances of the military mirrored that of the ordinary Egyptian, resentment against the ruling elite and the intrusive European powers. This broad-based support transformed Urabi's movement from a military mutiny into a nationalist revolt. The message was clear: Egypt for Egyptians, free from foreign dominance. However, Britain, deeply vested in Egypt due to the Suez Canal's strategic importance, viewed the Urabi-led movement as a threat. In 1882, alarmed by the nationalist fervor, British forces launched an intervention. The climax came at the Battle of Tel el-Kebir, where British troops defeated Urabi's army decisively. The aftermath was predictable. Ahmed Urabi was exiled to India, and while Egypt remained ostensibly an Ottoman province, it became a de facto British protectorate. The geopolitical realities of the Suez Canal and Britain's imperial designs meant that Egypt would remain under British influence for decades to come. On November 15, 1884, Chancellor of Germany Otto von Bismarck invited 14 representatives to Berlin to discuss the looming issue: colonization of Africa. At the time, it was politically necessary to spread the influence of your country over to the lands of another, because your regime would seem more powerful the more ground you could control. Since Europe had access to better military technology, they readily took over giant swaths of land. The issue, at least in the European minds, was that they didn't want to go to war with one another. Peace within Europe was the best way for them to reach prosperity. So, as the 14 nations met at the Berlin Conference, they decided to set the ground rules for how to colonize. During the conference, Germany had this idea that no colonial power should have any legal right to a territory unless the state exercised solid and effective political control, and if so, only for a limited period, essentially an occupational force. However, since England has been on the continent since the days of the slave ships of John Hawkins in 1562, they had a different idea. Like their colonies in India, they wanted to gain as much land on the continent as possible with minimal responsibility to make as much money as possible. Britain, represented by Edward Baldwin Mallet, got the conference to agree that any European nation could claim whatever land it liked with no repercussions. Of course, at this conference, there was no representation of Africa. No one at the meeting knew of their unique cultures, how the different tribes operated, and how they weren't all the same. At the Conference of Berlin, Africa was just a map that needed more European flags. Trades were made, Germany acknowledged Britain's claim over Zanzibar, and Britain acknowledged Germany's claim over Tanzania. This helped the British gain massive control within the African continent. The Protectorate of Bechuanaland was formed in modern-day Botswana. The British East African Company oversaw an area of 246,000 square miles from modern-day Somalia to Kenya. While in the south, the British South Africa Company wanted to expand the company from Cape to Cairo. However, this was never truly realized. Instead, they were relegated to the lands of modern-day Zimbabwe and Zambia. More handshakes and deals were to be made. In the Heligoland-Zanzibar Treaty, Germany ceded control of the Sultanate of Zanzibar, territories that would make up Kenya, and the Kingdom of Uganda, in exchange for Heligoland, an island off the coast of Germany, the Caprivi Strip, and large parts of Togoland and Cameroon and West Africa. Soon enough, the British found themselves in control of the British Nyasaland, present-day Malawi, through the British Central Africa Protectorate, the formal colonization status of Uganda, and the British East Africa Company to include most of the Kenyan regions. As the British drew these lines, conflicts with the native Africans were bound to happen. However, when the British forces were holding Maxim guns, the predecessor of the machine gun, and the Ndebele people, who were famous for their warfare, consisted of traditional spears and tall shields, the battle would be quickly decided. The British under Cecil Rhodes surrounded the Ndebele capital of Bulawayo and renamed the city to Rhodesia. The Ndebele people revolted again 3 years later in 1896, despite their known technological disadvantage. The revolts caught the settlers off guard, and they took refuge in forts like Rhodesia. However, as the months passed, the company, bolstered by reinforcements from the British Empire, began to turn the tide. The rebellion was brutally suppressed, leaders were captured, and a new era of dominance in Britain. The Ndebele people weren't the only ones to face the wrath of physical force. In 1897, Acting Consul General James Phillips believed he could reform the Kingdom of Benin, modern-day Nigeria, ending practices like human sacrifice. Without formal authorization, he ventured towards Benin City with a small party. even though he was warned of the risks during the kingdom's sacred season. His audacity met a tragic end at Ugbein village, where an ambush led by the Benin warriors claimed his life, and those of most of his party. Britain's response was swift and brutal. Admiral Sir Harry Rawson, armed with the Maxim guns, marshaled his forces. The goal was clear: retribution for Philips and the annexation of the kingdom. With their assegais and age-old strategies, the Benin warriors stood little chance against the British onslaught. Within weeks, the once majestic Benin city was aflame, its sacred bronzes pillaged and carried off to faraway lands as trophies of conquest. Benin was annexed into the British Empire. However, this line drawing sometimes led to conflict with other European powers. The remote settlement of Fashoda in Sudan was clearly claimed by the British. However, that didn't stop French captain Jean-Baptiste Marchand from placing the French flag at Fashoda when they arrived. When British General Sir Herbert Kitchener saw the flag, he knew something had to be done because of this transgression. A tense standoff ensued. Both Marchand and Kitchener, representing the interests of their nations, realized that a single gunshot on this remote riverbank could ignite a war between two of the world's great powers. Yet, neither wished for conflict. In the sticky heat, the two commanders met. Marchand spoke of France's claim and arduous journey, while Kitchener underlined Britain's strategic interests in the Nile. Despite the gravity of the situation, both exhibited a certain respect for each other, understanding the stakes at hand. Back in Europe, news of the Fashoda incident sent ripples through the corridors of power. Neither country wanted war, especially over a distant outpost. Diplomats scrambled. Negotiations began, and after some time, an agreement was reached. France would withdraw from Fashoda, marking the end of their eastward ambitions in Africa. Meanwhile, in the grasslands of South Africa, the gold was found in the territories of the Boers. By October 1899, these tensions erupted into open conflict. The Boers, leveraging their deep understanding of the local terrain, adopted guerrilla tactics. They secured early victories, besieging key British-held towns like Ladysmith, Kimberley, and Mafeking. The British, initially underestimating the Boers, found themselves on the defensive as the war raged on. The Boers, primarily farmers by trade but fierce fighters by necessity, were deft in guerrilla warfare, striking quickly and melting back into the vast South African landscape. Traditional military strategies failed against such tactics, leading British commanders to believe that the key to defeating the Boers was to target their logistical and moral support. In pursuit of victory, Field Marshal Lord Roberts, and later General Lord Kitchener, sanctioned a policy called Scorched Earth. The strategy involved the widespread burning of Boer farms and the destruction of their crops. The policy didn't stop at burning farms. To ensure that the Boer population couldn't aid their fighters, the British began relocating Boer civilians, predominantly women, children, and the elderly, to concentration camps. These camps were not designed for large-scale habitation and soon became notorious for their deplorable conditions. Malnutrition, poor sanitation, and diseases like typhoid fever decimated the camp populations, leading to the deaths of tens of thousands. Despite its high humanitarian cost, the Scorched Earth policy wore down the Boer resistance. In May of 1902, after long, hard-fought years and amidst a landscape scarred by war, the two sides came together. The Treaty of Vereeniging was signed, and the Boer republics became a part of the British Empire. As the years turned the clock to the 20th century, the British Empire spanned all across the globe. From the Dominion of Canada to Jamaica and St. Kitts in the Americas, to Cape Colony, the Gold Coast, and Sierra Leone in Africa, to British India, to Singapore, to Hong Kong in Asia, to Australia, New Zealand, and Fiji in Australia, Britain embodied the phrase, "The sun will never set." In 1907, the British tried to change their relationship with their subjects with some of their colonies during the Imperial Conference. The colonies of Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, and Newfoundland were given unprecedented rights to rule themselves while still being under the prowess of the Crown. While in Persia, the Anglo-Russian Convention of 1907 divided Persia into spheres of influence, the north under Russian influence and the southeast under British influence, with the central region remaining neutral, while those in the Middle East were just now starting to be of interest to the British Empire. In 1908, the Persian city of Masjid-i-Suleiman, 1,180 feet below the desert, was a large oil reserve, able to make any empire a fortune. In 1909, the Anglo-Persian Oil Company was formed, and within 30 minutes, all of their initial public offering stocks were sold out. The British needed to increase their control in the region. Their neighbors of Persia were the Ottomans, a fledgling empire trying to retain its former glory. But the British knew they could take their lands and continue growing their empire. That's why they needed a world war. Most people will claim that on June 28, 1914, Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary and his wife were assassinated in Sarajevo by Gavrilo Princip, a Bosnian Serb nationalist, started the war. However, the war was a battle of worldwide colonization. The Triple Entente, which featured France, Russia, and Britain, faced off against the Triple Alliance, which featured Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottomans. Germany wanted to expand their empire. The British wanted to expand their empire. France wanted to expand their empire. The Ottomans tried to keep it. As the war began, the British Expeditionary Force, BEF, was dispatched to the continent, where they confronted the Germans at the Battle of Mons. This initial conflict was marked by a robust British defense, stalling the German advance and commencing trench warfare's enduring, grim nature. The Western Front was a tangle of trenches, but the Allies sought to make strategic gains elsewhere. This led to the initiation of the Gallipoli Campaign. British, Australian, and New Zealand forces aimed to secure the Dardanelles Strait, hoping to knock the Ottoman Empire out of the war. However, instead of the anticipated swift victory, the campaign became a drawn-out ordeal with rugged terrains, stiff enemy resistance, and immense casualties. As the war was in a stalemate, the British and French had a secret agreement of what to do in the Middle East after the war. In this Sykes-Picot agreement, France would gain the territories of modern-day Syria and Lebanon, while the British would get the lands of Jordan, southern Iraq, and much of modern-day Israel. The Western Front saw another significant endeavor to break the stalemate, the Battle of the Somme. Initiated in July, this battle became one of the war's most significant engagements. Machine guns and fortified defenses thwarted hopes of a breakthrough. While some ground was gained, it came at a high cost, rendering the Somme a symbol of the war's futility and devastation. The war's deadlock led to repeated offensives, including the Battle of Arras. While initial gains were promising, it eventually became another battle of attrition. Later in the year, the Battle of Passchendaele became notorious for its muddy wasteland, making any advance almost impossible and leading to immense casualties. The war reached a turning point when Germany launched its Spring Offensive, a desperate attempt to break through Entente lines. Initially, the Germans made significant gains, pushing the Entente back. However, by summer, resilience, fresh American troops, and logistical strains on the Germans set the stage for the 100 Days Offensive. This series of Allied attacks gradually pushed the Germans back, eventually leading to the armistice in November, silencing the guns and marking the war's conclusion. When the Treaty of Versailles was signed in 1919, Germany was forced to surrender all their colonial territories, losing Tanganyika, modern-day Tanzania, to the British, Cameroon, and Togoland to a joint French-British coalition. In the Pacific, Nauru and the German colonies in New Guinea were placed under the joint mandate of Britain and Australia, while in the Middle East, the Ottoman Empire was fully dissolved. The Sykes-Picot Agreement was fully realized, and the British Empire stood at its peak. But yet, little did they know the sun was finally setting. The day always turns into night, and the end of the British Empire was upon us. The end of colonization was imminent. When one faces resistance, one must fight back. In the aftermath of World War I, India grew tired of being ignored by their colonial rulers. They wanted to speak out and fight. But in 1919, the Imperial Legislative Council in Delhi passed the Rowlatt Act, which allowed the police to arrest anyone without reason. There would be no trials, there would be no rights, and the accused wouldn't even know the evidence brought against them. The implementation was quick. Two non-violence leaders, Saifuddin Kichlu and Dr. Satyapal Singh, were arrested shortly after that. But instead of fighting with their swords, they fought with their actions. Under the guidance of Mahatma Gandhi, a new philosophy in resisting oppression was created, called Satyagraha, a Sanskrit word that means polite insistence on truth. Instead of getting angry and causing a war, politely resisting is the best way to fight. When the arrest of Kichlu and Singh was made public, thousands of Indians flocked to Jallianwala Bagh in Punjab to protest peacefully against the Rowlatt Act and the release of the activists wrongly in jail. Instead, Brigadier General Reginald Edward Harry Dyer surrounded the people with 50 riflemen. His men blocked the exit and then ordered them to shoot. As the protesters tried to flee, Dyer and his riflemen continued to fire until they ran out of ammunition, and 1,500 people lay dead. This led to the question, is nonviolence really the answer? Ireland would test out their theory in their way. In the 1918 election, Irish voters had a choice. Do they want to follow the radical nationalist party called the Sinn Féin, or do they still want to be in the British Empire? The unequivocal demand by Sinn Féin's leader, Eamon de Valera, was for a united and independent Ireland. They won 73 of the 105 Irish seats in the British Parliament in the election. By January 1919, they declared themselves independent and recreated their parliament. With their parliament, they created the Irish Republican Army, IRA, to resist British rule in Ireland under the rule of Michael Collins. In response, the British sent soldiers nicknamed the Black and Tans to fight and quell the Irish resistance. The first battle struck Soloheadbig, Tipperary. On a crisp January, 2 unsuspecting Black and Tans fell to an IRA ambush. This marked the first blood of a war that would rage on for 2 years. In November 1920, the event was dubbed Bloody Sunday. It would change the face of the war. In the early hours, the IRA, acting on Michael Collins' intelligence, targeted British agents across Dublin, leaving 14 British officers dead. In retaliation, later that day, the Black and Tans stormed into Dublin's Croke Park during a football match, killing 14 civilians in revenge. Angry, Tom Barry and his 36 men from the IRA took positions along the Macroom-Dunman Way Road near Kilmichael. They anticipated the movement of the Black and Tans. Barry's strategy was simple but daring. Allow the first lorry of auxiliaries to pass by, targeting the second to create a buffer, preventing any immediate retreat or forward charge. Camouflaged by the roadside, the men waited in tension. As the first lorry passed, it all happened in a flash. The men launched a ferocious up-close attack on the second vehicle, catching the auxiliaries off guard. Fighting was intense and hand-to-hand combat ensued. The first lorry soon realized the situation and returned, only to be met by a relentless barrage. When smoke cleared, 17 auxiliaries lay dead. The IRA had 3 casualties. But British forces, humiliated and angered by the audacity of the ambush and the scale of the loss, were quick to retaliate. Barely 2 weeks after Kilmichael, they attacked the city of Cork. They began by looting businesses and then escalating to arson. Residents awoke to an apocalyptic sight. The once thriving heart of Cork smoldered in ruins, the River Lee reflecting the embers of destruction. The sky was an eerie hue of orange, with dark plumes of smoke blotting the dawn. However, in 1921, Eamon de Valera negotiated a treaty with the British. Like the Confederation Catholics of Ireland in 1642, they created a parliament that swore an oath of allegiance to the British monarch. However, they would govern themselves as independent. Not all of Ireland agreed with the treaty. The 6 northern Anglican counties decided to remain part of the British Empire. So they formed their own country and were still represented in the British Parliament. Ireland was now separated. While back in India, the British Raj was struggling to hold power. To make money, the Raj imposed a salt tax, making it illegal for Indians to produce or sell salt without a colonial license. This simple oppressive act was a stark reminder of a colonial rule that had its grasp over the most fundamental aspects of Indian life. On the morning of March 12, 1930, Mahatma Gandhi and 78 ashram residents went on a protest march 240 miles to the coastal town of Dandi. On the march, they practiced satyagraha, showing respect and refusal to be violent against their oppressors. Gandhi and his group journeyed through dusty roads and met with swelling crowds. In every village and town, people gathered to catch a glimpse, hear him speak, and join in this act of defiance. The group grew, their footsteps echoing a rhythm of change, their path lined with flowers and accompanied by songs of freedom. With his walking stick in hand, Gandhi spoke fervently about non-violence and the injustice of the salt tax. He painted a vision of an India free from the shackles of colonial rule, urging his followers to embrace civil disobedience but always to remain peaceful. After 24 days, the sea came into view. The salty breeze hinted at their journey's end. On April 6th, as the first rays of dawn touched Dandi's shores, Gandhi bent down, scooped up a handful of mud and salt, and declared, "With this, I am shaking the foundations of the British Empire." Mass civil disobedience spread throughout India as millions broke the salt laws by making or burying illegal salt. Salt was sold illegally all over the coast of India. Not ready to give up, the British government arrested over 60,000 people by the end of the month. What had begun as a salt satyagraha quickly grew into a mass satyagraha. British clothes and goods were boycotted. Unpopular forest laws were defied in the Bombay, Mysore, and central provinces. Gujarati peasants refused to pay tax, fearing losing their crops and land. In Midnapore, Bengalis took part by refusing to pay the chowkidar tax. The British responded with more laws, including censorship of correspondence, and declaring the Congress and its associate organizations illegal. None of those measures slowed the civil disobedience movement. The people were willing to fight for their actions, and 5 years later, in 1935, their efforts were starting to pay off. The Government of India Act allowed India to rule itself partially. For the first time since the establishment of the Raj, an Indian representative was allowed to have power. In 1937, they had their first election. However, India would be placed on the back burner, as Germany, under Adolf Hitler, was invading Poland. Britain, upholding its guarantee to the Polish state, declared war. The echoes of those war declarations, paired with Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain's grim voice over the radio, permeated British households. But for most, this war was initially distant, with no significant ground conflicts, leading many to call it the phony war. However, the illusion of a remote war was shattered in 1940, as the German war machine blitzed through Europe. British forces were quickly pushed back to the beaches of Dunkirk. The situation seemed dire. Yet across the English Channel, an armada of vessels ranging from Navy ships to fishing boats sailed to rescue stranded soldiers in what became known as Operation Dynamo. Families across Britain rejoiced as 338,000 troops returned, but the triumph was short-lived. The Battle of Britain saw the skies above London and other cities transformed into war zones. Night after night, families huddled in underground stations as the Luftwaffe dropped their deadly payloads. The spirit of defiance was captured in Churchill's voice, declaring that Britain would never surrender. 1941 brought hope. Though not yet in the war, America began supporting Britain with vital supplies under the Lease-Lend Agreement. By December, following the attack on Pearl Harbor, the U.S. joined the Allies, bolstering British morale. The war's tides began turning in 1942. General Montgomery's troops faced Rommel's forces in the vast deserts of North Africa. The pivotal Battle of El Alamein led to a sweeping Allied victory, but the joy was bittersweet as news from the East arrived. Singapore had fallen to the Japanese. In the subsequent years, Britain participated in a series of crucial operations, from the hot sands of Sicily to the snowy landscapes of the Netherlands. The pivotal moment came in 1944 with the D-Day landings. British forces, alongside their American and Canadian allies, stormed the beaches of Normandy, initiating the beginning of the end for Hitler's Europe. Yet, even as victory in Europe was celebrated in May 1945, with jubilant crowds flooding London streets, the war raged on in the East. It wasn't until August, after the devastating atomic bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, that the war ended. With the fall of Hitler, the interest in large colonial empires was done. Even though Great Britain may have won the war, it was the final bullet in the empire. Their former colony, America, who revolted in 1776, would become the next great empire on a colonial stage. As the British Empire was winding down, in the heart of Delhi, Sir Louis Mountbatten, the last British Viceroy of India, gazed at the vast subcontinent on the cusp of monumental change. Soon, the tricolour flag of India and the green crescent of Pakistan would fly high, signaling the end of British rule in India. Years passed, and as the 1950s dawned, optimism and determination washed over the African continent. In the Gold Coast, Kwame Nkrumah passionately spoke of self-rule and destiny. By 1957, jubilant Ghanaians danced in the streets of Accra, celebrating the birth of an independent Ghana. Over in Malaya, amidst dense rainforests, Tunku Abdul Rahman, a prince and statesman, rallied his people. They sang songs that dreamt of unity, and in 1957, Malaya stood independent, later forming a larger union known as Malaysia. But freedom's journey wasn't without its trials. In Cyprus, tension brewed between the Greeks and Turks, often pulling British soldiers into the fray. The island's beauty was often overshadowed by the sporadic bursts of violence that threatened its peace. As the sun set in the 1960s, the African continent transformed. Flags bearing new symbols and colors rose in Nigeria, Uganda, Kenya, and beyond. African leaders, educated at home and in the very heart of the empire, led their nations with a blend of traditional wisdom and modern insights. The Caribbean wasn't left behind. The rhythmic beats of reggae and Jamaica echoed the nation's newfound freedom, while in Trinidad and Tobago, the fusion of cultures heralded the birth of a nation. By the 1980s, far from the African savannas and Caribbean beaches, the British grappled with a different challenge. In Zimbabwe, then Southern Rhodesia, Robert Mugabe and his guerrillas waged a war against British rule. The result was a free Zimbabwe, albeit with scars that would take time to heal. But perhaps the most poignant moment came in 1997 in the bustling city of Hong Kong. The Union Jack was lowered, and the Red Star of China took its place. Watching alongside the city's leaders, Prince Charles represented an empire bidding farewell to its last significant outpost. As the sun finally sets on the British Empire, the world has forever changed. From the land stolen from the natives, the lines drawn in Africa, to the stolen artifacts held in the British museums, the effects of colonization could be still felt around the world. As the darkness of the night covers the London sky, who knows what'll be in store for the United Kingdom? Their history is still being written.